Around 3500 BC, the southern plains between the Tigris and Euphrates began to change in ways no human community had ever attempted. Seasonal floods that once dictated migration were being measured, channeled, and stored. Across the deltaic horizon, the first irrigation ditches shimmered under the Mesopotamian sun, carving a human geometry into the alluvial silt. Villages that had endured by memory and habit began recording quantities of grain and herds on clay tokens impressed with reed styluses. By 3200 BC, these markings evolved into the earliest writing system, cuneiform, the abstraction of administration into symbol. Excavations at Uruk revealed temple precincts whose foundations were aligned to celestial paths, their walls coated with bitumen and shell mosaics. Stratigraphic data indicates successive rebuildings across centuries, each layer recording not merely architecture, but the slow invention of urban life. This civilization, later called Sumer, became the first to fuse environment, ritual, and record into a continuous mechanism of order. It is here that kingship emerged from priesthood, that taxation preceded coinage, that city planning and law were first codified in clay. From Sumer flowed the grammar of civilization itself, writing, governance, and measured time. Continue as we examine how river, ritual, and record shaped the world's first organized society. By the close of the 6th millennium BC, climatic oscillations across the Near East were quietly redrawing the boundaries of human habitation. The Arabian Peninsula, once greener and more temperate, began to desiccate. Seasonal streams faded, herds moved northward, and human groups followed the receding belts of rainfall toward the great river basins of Mesopotamia. The twin rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, carried mountain silt downstream, depositing it into a vast, shifting delta where land and water intertwined. What emerged was neither sea nor desert, but a mutable plain, a geography of promise and danger. Archaeological sediment cores from Ur and Eridu demonstrate alternating layers of flood clay and habitation debris, proving that early settlers endured cycles of devastation and renewal. Radiocarbon dating from these strata centers occupation around 5300 BC, when the first permanent structures appear along elevated ridges safe from inundation. Life in this environment demanded more than endurance. It required prediction. Early communities learned to read the rhythm of the rivers, to measure flood stages, and to dig small drainage channels that transformed temporary fields into sustainable plots. Excavations at Tel Auli and Choga Mami reveal narrow irrigation ditches lined with reeds and stabilized by baked clay segments, the earliest known hydraulic architecture. The introduction of controlled water flow was both an agricultural and social event. Managing canals demanded coordination, labor scheduling, and stored knowledge of seasons. Thus, the first administrators were not kings, but surveyors, men and women who measured water and grain. By 4500 BC, tokens and counters made of limestone and clay appear in habitation layers, representing quantities of livestock or produce. These were the primitive numerals of civilization, physical abstractions that turned harvest into data. Meanwhile, the environment itself shaped belief. The unpredictable flood became the first metaphor for divine will. Ritual pits uncovered at Eridu contain offerings of fish bones, clay figurines, and burnt grain, evidence of propitiation to forces beyond human control. Stratigraphic sequencing reveals that each rebuilding of the Eridu temple coincided with a major flood event, suggesting that reconstruction was both a practical and religious response. In these cycles of destruction and renewal, the Sumerians found the pattern of existence. Their cosmology grew from sediment and silt, from the observation that water gave life, yet also reclaimed it. The growth of irrigation technology triggered demographic concentration. Villages once separated by kilometers of wilderness began to merge through shared canal systems. The resulting networks became corridors of exchange, of goods, labor, and language. Archaeological surveys in the lower Tigris Valley show standardized pottery styles emerging around 4200 BC, indicating cultural unification across settlements. The famed Ubaid ware, with its painted geometric motifs, spread from Eridu northward, signaling both trade and shared ideology. The Ubaid period marks the transition from isolated communities to a regional civilization. Excavated house plans show multi-room dwellings with central halls, suggesting growing family complexity and property differentiation. Social hierarchy was materializing in brick and clay long before it was proclaimed in text. By the dawn of the 4th millennium BC, the climate stabilized into predictable wet and dry seasons, enabling larger-scale agriculture. Fields of barley and emmer wheat stretched across the plains, bounded by low embankments. Remains of storage jars at Auli and grain silos at Eridu indicate the emergence of collective surplus, a condition that transformed economy into institution. With surplus came specialization, potters, weavers, and metalworkers replacing the generalized labor of subsistence. The archaeological record preserves this transformation in the distribution of artifacts. Tools once made locally appear imported from distant sites, implying craft differentiation and exchange. The plain of Sumer was becoming an interconnected laboratory of innovation. Conceptually, this shift from village to city was less a leap than a gradient. The Sumerians did not invent civilization overnight. They inherited a landscape that required cooperation to survive. The canals that fed their crops also delineated their communities. To maintain them demanded negotiation, leadership, and record-keeping. What began as seasonal coordination evolved into permanent administration. Clay tokens stored in sealed envelopes bully appear in late Ubaid strata, each enclosing a set of counters representing deliveries or taxes. When the envelopes were opened, impressions of the tokens were pressed on the surface, creating the earliest prototypes of written documents. This bureaucratic necessity, born from water management, laid the foundation for writing itself. As populations thickened along the deltaic plain, settlement density reached unprecedented levels. By 4000 BC, tell sites such as Eridu, Uruk, and Nipwa stood only a few hours apart on foot, each ringed by a patchwork of fields glistening under irrigation channels. Excavations conducted by the University of Chicago in the Nipwa Basin reveal layered field boundaries, visible as alternating strata of silty loam and canal silt, a geological map of human persistence. The labor required to maintain this landscape was immense. Entire seasons were devoted to clearing silt, reinforcing levees, and redistributing flow through smaller ditches called akalu. Tablet fragments from slightly later levels describe work rotations and collective corvée, implying that the model of civic labor predated kingship. Agriculture was not merely subsistence, it was the mechanism that created the first civic obligation. Evidence from animal remains complements this picture. Faunal analyses at Tel Abada indicate a transition from mixed herding to controlled animal management. Sheep and goats were selectively bred for wool and milk yield, and their bones show distinctive pathologies linked to pennied rearing. This points to long-term planning and resource calculation, a shift from opportunistic exploitation to managed production. The economic consequences were profound. Textiles began to supplement grain as a tradable commodity, and with that diversification came proto-industrial organization. Even before writing, accounting existed in material form, differing bead types, color-coded clays, and seals marking property. The first bureaucracy arose from hands that once farmed and sheared. Meanwhile, settlement design underwent a subtle revolution. Excavations at Eridu's late Ubaid levels reveal houses aligned around open courtyards, each with a central hearth and storage bin. The alignment was not random. Drainage lines follow consistent orientations, hinting at early civic planning. The shift from scattered huts to ordered compounds signaled the birth of collective spatial logic, an unspoken grammar of proximity that would later govern cities. Ceramic typology charts from British excavations illustrate a rapid standardization in form and volume. Jars and bowls were calibrated to contain specific measures of grain or oil. This synchronization of material culture indicates not aesthetic convergence, but administrative necessity. The physical world was being organized to match the cognitive world of measurement. Environmental evidence adds another layer to this transformation. Pollen spectra from cores near ancient marshes show decreasing wild vegetation and increasing cultivated species between 4200 and 3800 BC. The human footprint expanded, yet dependence on irrigation intensified salinity in the upper soil horizons. Sodium concentrations measured in ancient field deposits reveal early signs of ecological stress. It is likely that these pressures drove technological adaptation, the invention of new plowing techniques and water rotation systems. Each innovation represented both triumph and warning. Mastery of the environment bound the Sumerians ever more tightly to it. By the later Ubaid and Proto-Uruk phases, specialized sites emerged to process surplus goods. At Tel Ukiah, archaeologists uncovered large rectangular buildings with central halls and storage rooms, possibly serving as communal distribution centers. The discovery of seal impressions there suggests controlled access and accountability. Authority was no longer confined to kinship. It was vested in those who could manage flow of water, grain, and labor alike. From this nexus of control grew the concept of temple economy, where offerings to deities mirrored the redistributive functions of administration. The divine and the bureaucratic began to converge, each legitimizing the other. Conceptually, what defined the awakening of the Fertile Crescent was not monumental architecture or conquest, but the quiet calibration of human rhythm to environmental time. The Sumerians learned to think in seasons, to record the pulse of the rivers as a sequence of predictable numbers. In doing so, they transformed uncertainty into structure. Civilization's first equation was written not in symbols, but in the alignment of furrows to the flow of a river. By 3800 BC, the landscape of southern Mesopotamia had become a vast, engineered mosaic of canals, fields, and embankments stretching from the Euphrates Delta toward the interior marshes. Survey transects across the Uruk, Eridu region reveal a remarkable density of minor waterways, many now buried beneath meters of silt, but detectable through satellite infrared imaging. Their parallel orientations and consistent gradients imply central planning and hydraulic knowledge equal to that of later dynastic Egypt. These were not the incidental channels of subsistence farmers, they were infrastructural veins feeding a collective organism. At their nodes stood small shrines and administrative houses, the embryonic organs of the city-state. Material evidence points to an equally significant social shift. Burial analysis from the Ubaid cemeteries near Ur shows clear differentiation in grave goods. Fine painted ceramics, copper ornaments, and imported obsidian appear only in a minority of tombs. This disparity, emerging around 4000 BC, signals the rise of a managerial elite, perhaps priests or proto-rulers overseeing the redistribution of goods. Yet power was still transactional rather than absolute. Tokens and seals recovered from nearby domestic layers demonstrate that economic control was mediated through trust, symbol, and record rather than coercion. The city, in its nascent form, was a machine of consensus built on the arithmetic of exchange. Excavations at Eridu's level VI temple provide a rare glimpse into how sacred and civic authority intertwined. Beneath layers of windblown sand, archaeologists uncovered altars coated with bitumen and inlaid with mother-of-pearl fragments, surrounded by storage jars and accounting tokens. Radiocarbon dating aligns these with the late Ubaid period, around 4200–4000 BC. Such findings confirm that ritual spaces doubled as warehouses and distribution centers, where offerings to the gods were indistinguishable from civic taxation. The temple, therefore, was less a house of worship than the first public institution, embodying the fusion of economy, theology, and record-keeping. The rhythm of daily life mirrored these structural evolutions. Clay sickles, spindle whorls, and loom weights recovered from habitation quarters indicate specialized domestic industries. Women, often represented in small terracotta figurines, likely managed textile production within extended households, while men rotated between field labor and canal maintenance. The balance between household economy and public works created a social symmetry that sustained early urbanization. In every action, weaving, digging, tallying, the Sumerians rehearsed the logic of coordination that would later define their civilization. Meanwhile, contacts extended beyond the delta. Obsidian from Anatolia and copper from Oman appear in late Ubaid contexts, proving that trade networks already spanned thousands of kilometers. These materials, confirmed by neutron activation analysis, were exchanged not merely for utility, but as symbols of connection, each foreign stone a tangible proof of distant alliance. Such links foreshadowed the maritime and overland routes that would later bind Sumer to Elam, Dilmun, and the Indus Valley. The Fertile Crescent was becoming a corridor of interaction, its people mediating between worlds through river and sea. As environmental stability continued, population pressure intensified. Archaeobotanical studies from Auli show a steady reduction in wild plant remains, replaced by cultivated species in controlled rotation. Barley became dominant due to its higher salt tolerance, revealing early adaptation to soil salinization. The shift from emmer wheat to barley was both agronomic and cultural, a recognition that mastery over nature required concession as well as control. The pattern would repeat throughout Mesopotamian history. Environmental challenge answered by innovation, innovation producing dependence, dependence inviting vulnerability. The Fertile Crescent's awakening was thus not a moment, but a process, a slow, sedimentary accumulation of decisions, each embedded in the landscape as surely as the canals themselves. In these centuries before Uruk's rise, humanity crossed an invisible threshold, from living within nature's cycles to orchestrating them. That transition, once made, could not be undone. By the early 4th millennium BC, the plain of Sumer had become a living document of human design. Every irrigation trench, storage jar, and clay seal recorded the progressive domestication of chance. Stratified remains at sites such as Tel al-Ubaid and Uruk mark the onset of the Uruk period, a cultural horizon where the landscape itself became an archive of order. Aerial and geomagnetic surveys reveal rectilinear street grids and concentric settlement rings encircling temple complexes. These features, once invisible beneath centuries of deposition, confirm that urban geometry was already deliberate. The evolution from village to city was a continuum of administrative necessity. The more water one controlled, the more records one required. The more records one required, the more centralized authority became. Archaeological layers dated between 3800 and 3400 BC show a proliferation of bevel-rimmed bowls, mass-produced clay vessels of uniform shape and volume. Their ubiquity across southern Mesopotamia suggests use as standardized rations for laborers employed in temple projects. Microscopic residue analysis of their interiors shows traces of barley gruel and beer sediment, indicating that food distribution was a managed, quantifiable operation. These bowls were, in effect, the first pay slips, the currency of a rationed economy where sustenance equaled wage. The humble bowl thus stands as material testimony to the rise of institutional labor, a quiet revolution recorded in clay. Contemporaneous with this administrative expansion was an unprecedented growth in material craft. Kiln sites at Uruk's Ina district yield evidence of continuous ceramic production, with wasters and misfired fragments forming entire occupational layers. The organization of these kilns into rows suggests workshop guilds operating under supervision. Copper smelting debris at Teep Gora and Tel Brak, traced through isotopic ratios, revealed trade in raw ores from Anatolia and Iran. Mythology introduced new symbolic and economic hierarchies. Control of bronze and copper marked status as effectively as ownership of land. These innovations coincided with the emergence of the first monumental buildings constructed from standardized plano-convex bricks, a technology that required precise measurement and collective effort. Meanwhile, at the heart of the southern delta, Eridu's temple rose again, rebuilt on the ruins of its earlier predecessors. Excavators uncovered altars coated with thick bitumen layers, fragments of imported shell, and conical clay nails once embedded in walls for decorative mosaics. Radiocarbon samples placed this construction near 3500 BC, when Eridu stood as both sanctuary and administrative hub. Here, the high platform of the temple symbolized a new social hierarchy: elevation as divinity, access as privilege. The community that once worshipped on flat ground now looked upward to power. Climate models derived from Lake cores across the Near East indicate that around 3500 BC rainfall decreased by nearly 20%, narrowing flood seasons and forcing greater dependence on irrigation canals. This environmental stress paradoxically accelerated urban concentration. Populations moved toward regions where water management was most advanced, clustering around nodes such as Uruk, Lagash, and Nipwa. Each settlement adapted the same formula: temple at the center, granary beside it, administrative court nearby, residential quarters spreading outward. The physical design reflected a conceptual order, a spatial manifestation of control radiating from the divine to the communal. The last centuries of the Ubaid world thus witnessed the first signs of collective identity that transcended lineage. Clay seal impressions bear recurring motifs: reed bundles, temple facades, animal emblems signifying institutional rather than personal ownership. Authority was becoming abstract, embedded in symbols rather than individuals. This abstraction was civilization's quiet triumph, the ability to represent obligation, debt, and hierarchy through image and inscription. It was not kingship yet, but the precondition for it. By 3400 BC, the urban seed had fully germinated. Eridu began to decline as Uruk ascended, its population swelling beyond anything previously imaginable. Excavations reveal continuous occupation layers nearly 8 meters deep, each one a microcosm of evolving administration, trade, and ritual. The Fertile Crescent had awakened not as a mythic paradise, but as an engineered ecosystem, a partnership between human intent and geological memory. From the confluence of rivers and will, the idea of civilization had taken root. The next chapter will trace that root's flowering, the rise of Uruk, the world's first city, where writing, architecture, and governance merged into a single organism of record and ritual. By 5400 BC, when the first settlers laid clay foundations at the edge of the receding gulf, Eridu was little more than a raised mound on a coastal marsh. Yet within a few centuries, it would become the nucleus of a civilizational experiment, a site where architecture and theology fused into a single expression of permanence. Archaeological excavations directed by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd in the mid-20th century revealed an extraordinary stratigraphy: 17 successive temple levels built one atop another, each slightly larger, higher, and more complex than the last. Radiocarbon analysis of organic inclusions in the lower bricks anchors the earliest phases to around 5300 BC, confirming that Eridu predates Uruk, and Nipur by nearly a millennium. The physical sequence of temples documents an intellectual ascent. The first structures were modest, single-room shrines of packed mud brick with altars at the western wall, oriented toward the setting sun. Later phases added side chambers, courtyards, and buttressed facades. Each reconstruction used the debris of the previous as fill for the next, literally elevating the sacred above the mortal. In this incremental act of rebuilding, the Sumerians invented the concept of vertical sanctity, height as holiness, foundation as memory. The ziggurat, that quintessential Mesopotamian symbol, was foreshadowed here centuries before it acquired its monumental form. Excavations yielded not only architecture but context. Around the earliest shrines, archaeologists discovered clay figurines of fish and serpents, charred animal bones, and bitumen-coated offering bowls. These finds, coupled with cuneiform references from later periods, identify the temple's deity as Enki, lord of the subterranean waters, patron of wisdom, and guardian of craft. The location of Eridu beside a marsh fed by freshwater springs aligns with this association. Geochemical analysis of groundwater deposits confirms the presence of artesian upwelling in antiquity, lending natural credibility to the mythic Abzu, the deep watery realm beneath the earth. For the inhabitants of Eridu, the sacred was geological. Holiness rose from the ground itself. Material traces show how ritual and administration became intertwined. Beneath the floors of later temples, sealed caches of tokens and accounting tablets have been unearthed, clay counters denoting sheep, oil, or grain, stored within rooms adjacent to altars. This juxtaposition is deliberate. Offerings to the gods were simultaneously entries in an inventory. Religion was bookkeeping sanctified. The priests who tallied grain also officiated sacrifice. The temple's holiness conferred legitimacy on the economic order. It was within these walls that the idea of divine stewardship over material goods took form, an ideology that would define Mesopotamian governance for 2 millennia. Meanwhile, Eridu's civic fabric grew outward from its sanctum. Surrounding habitation layers reveal densely packed houses of uniform orientation, suggesting planning consistent with religious centrality. Streets converge upon the temple mound, and pottery workshops cluster along its base, implying that production revolved around temple demand. Petrographic studies of ceramic clay sources show that materials were imported from several kilometers away, indicating organized procurement rather than opportunistic gathering. The temple's authority extended through supply chains, embedding sacred power into daily labor. Conceptually, the architecture of Eridu transformed mud into meaning. Each brick, pressed by hand and dried under the same sun that baked the surrounding plain, carried within it the assertion that human order could endure environmental flux. The repeated act of rebuilding was not merely repair but liturgy, the ritual of continuity. Through it, architecture ceased to be shelter and became symbol, a physical theology rendered in clay. By 4800 BC, the shrine of Eridu had expanded into a multi-tiered platform dominating the marshland horizon. Excavation drawings record its successive enlargements with meticulous precision, each new temple layer constructed directly above the ruins of its predecessor, preserving the same axis, orientation, and altar position. In architectural terms, this constancy reveals a sacred geometry. In cultural terms, it shows the birth of institutional memory. Every generation reaffirmed the same design, not because of aesthetic inertia, but to sustain a dialogue with its ancestors. Archaeological sediment within the temple fill contains fragments of earlier altars intentionally crushed and mixed with the new foundations, an act scholars interpret as consecration by continuity. At the summit of the mound, later levels exhibit a transformation from domestic simplicity to monumental ambition. Brick molds grew larger, joints tighter, walls plastered with gypsum and painted in white lime wash that would have gleamed in the harsh southern light. Conical clay nails, thousands of which have been recovered, were pressed into facades to create glittering surfaces of alternating color and texture. These decorative techniques, far from ornamental, performed an optical theology. As the sun moved, the temple appeared to shimmer like the surface of water, invoking Enki's domain. Archaeochemical analysis of surviving pigments shows traces of copper compounds and bitumen binding, confirming the intentional play of light and hue. Around this architectural core lay evidence of sustained ritual economy. Adjacent rooms contained large ovens, storage jars, and thick accumulations of ash, suggesting periodic feasting or redistribution events. Faunal assemblages are dominated by sheep and fish remains, many displaying butchery marks consistent with ceremonial slaughter. Botanical residues include barley, dates, and emmer wheat, preserved through charring. These finds correspond closely to later Sumerian ritual texts describing offerings to temple deities. The continuity between artifact and inscription, separated by millennia, demonstrates how ritual practice preserved institutional function long before literacy. The surrounding settlement mirrored this sacred center's growing complexity. Excavations across Eridu's lower mound expose rectangular houses with central courtyards and granaries, aligned to a consistent grid oriented toward the temple. Drainage channels ran beneath thresholds, carrying waste toward the marsh. Even in its earliest urban stage, Eridu demonstrates a command of civic hygiene and planning. Magnetometer surveys reveal parallel street lines and open squares, the embryo of the Mesopotamian city plan. Urban form here was a byproduct of theology, order radiating from the divine house outward through every dwelling. Economic data extracted from nearby sites reinforced the notion that temples functioned as distribution hubs. In later Ubaid phases, seal impressions bearing the image of reed bundles, likely symbols of Enki, appear on jars of oil and grain. These marks served as administrative signatures, ensuring quality and quantity control. Comparative seal typologies show regional variation but shared motifs, implying communication between distant communities under similar religious frameworks. The temple, therefore, was not isolated. It participated in a network of sanctuaries, exchanging goods, knowledge, and ritual objects. Conceptually, the rise of Eridu's sacred architecture embodies civilization's first successful abstraction of faith into form. The temple's vertical axis united earth, water, and sky in a single composition, turning geology into cosmology. Its permanence anchored belief in an unpredictable landscape, translating the flux of floods and droughts into the stability of structure. In every layer of its bricks lies evidence that the Sumerians had discovered a profound correlation. To build was to remember, and to remember was to rule. By 4400 BC, Eridu had become a fixed point in the shifting delta, a mound that stood above the marshes like a geological memory of human persistence. Excavations of its upper Ubaid levels reveal that each rebuilding phase increased not only the temple's size, but its administrative complexity. Peripheral buildings began to cluster along the lower terraces, forming what archaeologists now call the temple precinct. These structures, storehouses, workshops, and small courtyards, formed a concentric arrangement around the central shrine, turning worship into an organized enterprise. Clay ceilings from these layers, many bearing identical motifs, indicate controlled entry and resource accountability. The first evidence of personnel hierarchy appears in these seals, different emblems for various offices, suggesting a division between priestly authority, overseers, and craftsmen. The temple was becoming an institution with departments, ranks, and records. At the core of this evolving order lay the interplay between divine legitimacy and material management. The cult of Enki emphasized wisdom, measurement, and craft, qualities mirrored in the precision of the temple's layout. Excavators uncovered clay tablets bearing incised numerical notations, simple tallies of livestock or grain. Though predating true cuneiform, these marks show that symbolic accounting had entered sacred space. Offerings and rations were no longer ephemeral acts, they were transactions committed to clay. This union of ritual and record made the temple both a house of the gods and the first archive of humankind. The distribution of artifacts across the site further illustrates the integration of economy and theology. In rooms adjoining the main hall, archaeologists found rows of identical jars, their bases coated with residue of date syrup and sesame oil, materials used for both cuisine and anointing. Large stone mortars bear traces of copper and malachite powders, likely for pigment preparation used in wall decoration and perhaps in cosmetic rites. The presence of imported stones, diorite from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, demonstrates early long-distance exchange centered on the temple's prestige. Trade, ritual, and governance converged within its walls. Meanwhile, the city's relationship with its environment remained intimate and deliberate. Geomorphological studies show that Eridu's inhabitants diverted small canals from nearby streams, creating artificial basins around the temple mound. These acted as both reservoirs and symbolic moats, reflecting the temple's image in water, a physical manifestation of Enki's subterranean domain. When floods came, the mound stood as an island of order amid chaos, confirming its cosmological purpose. The architecture itself was a map of the world as the Sumerians perceived it, the temple as the axis between the deep waters, the surface earth, and the heavens above. Social stratification deepened as this sacred economy matured. Burial sites from the same horizon exhibit variations in wealth and ornamentation, some interred with copper pins and shell jewelry, others with none. Yet across all grave, one motif persists: small clay cones or fish figurines placed beside the body, echoing Eridu's aquatic theology. Death and water were linked as thresholds between realms. Through such uniform symbols, a collective identity emerged that transcended kinship, a theological citizenship under the temple's domain. Conceptually, Eridu's invention of sacred architecture achieved more than monumentality. It articulated an early philosophy of order. The temple was not a static structure, but a mechanism, an interface between natural cycles and human intent. In its rising tiers, humanity rehearsed its first theory of governance, that the stability of the world required measured rebuilding, ritual maintenance, and administrative foresight. The mound thus stands as both artifact and metaphor for civilization's recurring pattern, creation through reconstruction. By 4000 BC, Eridu had reached the culmination of its formative arc. The temple complex, rising above the plain in gleaming tiers of plaster and fired brick, dominated both the horizon and the imagination of its inhabitants. From the marshes, the structure appeared as a deliberate contradiction to the flat world surrounding it, geometry imposed upon geology. Excavation data reveal successive rebuildings with increasingly standardized materials, bricks of equal dimensions stamped with mason's marks, joints laid in precise horizontal courses, drainage conduits cut into foundations to channel runoff from seasonal rains. Such technical refinements, verified by microstratigraphic analysis, suggest not only architectural progress, but institutional continuity, with trained specialists preserving exact construction methods across generations. Ceramic typologies from adjacent strata point to intensified specialization in craft industries. Kiln debris found near the temple precinct, alongside slag and ash deposits, attest to large-scale pottery production serving ritual and domestic demand. Some vessels bear impressed symbols matching temple seal motifs, early indications of centralized control over goods. Isotopic studies of bitumen and copper residues trace their origins to northern Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, proving that Eridu's economic sphere reached far beyond its floodplain. Through the circulation of resources, the city transformed from an isolated sanctuary into the hub of a network that linked mountains, deserts, and sea. The social landscape evolved accordingly. Excavations of residential quarters at the mound's periphery uncover stratified architecture, small two-room dwellings built beside larger, more elaborate houses with storage annexes and private courtyards. This differentiation mirrors occupational hierarchies that temple administration required. Clay accounting tokens appear in domestic contexts, implying that ordinary households participated in institutional exchange systems. The temple was no longer a remote citadel. It was the regulating heart of a civic organism, pulsing through every household's economy. Within the sanctum, evidence of ritual precision multiplies. Ash layers mixed with crushed gypsum and charred barley form repeating bands within the temple fill traces of cyclical cleansing ceremonies. Faunal remains show selective slaughter of young male goats and sheep, consistent with controlled herd management rather than random sacrifice. Chemical analysis of burnt residues identifies aromatic compounds from imported cedar and juniper resin, suggesting that the scent of distant forests perfumed each ritual. The sensory dimension of worship thus mirrored its intellectual one, the ordering of smell, sound, and color to reinforce cosmological harmony. Meanwhile, the symbolic vocabulary of the temple expanded. Decorative cones embedded in outer walls formed mosaic patterns resembling reeds, waves, and stylized fish, motifs aligned with Enki's domain of water and fertility. These images also encoded a political message: the temple as mediator between abundance and chaos, priesthood as guarantor of equilibrium. With every rebuild, the height of the platform increased by roughly 1 meter, culminating in a stepped terrace whose summit served as the altar. This vertical layering embodied a metaphysical hierarchy, the lowest level anchored in the moist clay of the Abzu, the uppermost reaching toward the sunlit sky. When the last Ubaid phase faded around 3800 BC, Eridu's influence began to wane, eclipsed by the rising center of Uruk to the north. Yet its architectural and ideological template endured. The ziggurats, bureaucracies, and priestly systems of later Sumer were all descendants of this marshland experiment. Even in ruin, Eridu retained its authority, not as a living capital, but as a memory of origins. Later Sumerian king lists would mythologize it as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. The phrase captures a profound historical truth. In Eridu, power ceased to be provisional and became architectural, measured, and divine. Conceptually, Eridu's story concludes where civilization begins. The Temple Mound embodied the human realization that stability could be constructed, that memory could be built layer upon layer until it touched the eternal. From these foundations, all later cities inherited their grammar of form, hierarchy, and faith. In every ziggurat that rose after, the shadow of Eridu's first platform endured, a silent reminder that the House of the Gods was humanity's first design for permanence. By 3500 BC, the low floodplain that once echoed with the quiet rhythm of canal villages had transformed into the most complex urban environment humanity had ever constructed. Uruk, situated near the confluence of ancient river channels on the Euphrates, rose from the fertile alluvium like a deliberate experiment in scale. Archaeological mapping reveals that the settlement expanded across nearly 250 hectares at its height, 10 times larger than Eridu, and enclosed within its walls a population estimated between 20 and 40,000 people. Such density had no precedent. Every brick, pathway, and wall in Uruk expressed a single civilizational breakthrough, the idea that order could be engineered through administration rather than lineage. Excavations led by the German Oriental Society in the early 20th century uncovered two distinct temple districts dominating the city, the Ina precinct and the Anu ziggurat. Their coexistence defines Uruk's dual nature, spiritual and administrative. The Ina quarter, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, demonstrates the full maturity of monumental architecture. Successive building phases reveal vast courtyards, columned halls, and relief-adorned facades of colored clay cones arranged in complex mosaics. Each phase was constructed atop the ruins of the previous, echoing the Eridu pattern, but now executed at monumental scale. Radiocarbon analysis places the earliest Ina foundations around 3400 BC, with continuous rebuilding for nearly a millennium. Meanwhile, the Anu ziggurat, rising from a massive platform of mud brick, embodied celestial aspiration. Its stepped terraces, accessible by a broad ramp, culminated in a white limestone temple visible across the plain. Stratigraphic data indicate that the platform reached nearly 15 meters in height, a symbolic mountain within the alluvial flatlands. Around its base, archaeologists found thousands of conical nails stamped with the names of rulers and dedicatory inscriptions, providing the earliest written references to political identity. Through architecture, Uruk's citizens externalized hierarchy, elevation equaled authority, inscription equaled legitimacy. Material culture across the site reveals an economy of astonishing organization. Bevel-rimmed bowls, those utilitarian containers once seen in Eridu's late levels, now occur by the tens of thousands, standardized to near-uniform dimensions. Their frequency in both temple refuse and residential quarters suggests rationing on an industrial scale. Petrographic analyses of clay samples confirm centralized production from limited sources, likely controlled by temple workshops. In these bowls, one can trace the logistics of the first mass labor system. Food, wages, and ritual offerings were measured, distributed, and recorded with bureaucratic precision. Uruk's expansion was not purely material, it was conceptual. Within its walls, the abstraction of number, word, and law coalesced. Excavations of the Ina precinct produced hundreds of clay tablets bearing incised pictographs, records of grain allotments, herd counts, and temple inventories. These are the world's earliest known written documents, dating to around 3300 BC. Initially, they served as mnemonic aids for accountants, but their evolution was swift. Tokens once stored in bully became redundant. Instead, impressions on flat clay surfaces preserved information directly. The administrative necessity that had shaped Eridu here matured into literacy. Meanwhile, specialized professions multiplied. Evidence from tool assemblages and craft debris shows organized workshops for metallurgy, textiles, and ceramics. Loom weights found in residential compounds suggest that weaving had become a major industry, likely overseen by temple administrators. The variety of spindle whorls and dyed threads indicates both gendered labor and controlled production. Chemical analysis of pigments recovered from textile impressions reveals trade in indigo and madder, materials imported from regions as far as the Iranian plateau. Uruk's economic network thus extended beyond the horizon, transforming Mesopotamia into the center of an interregional system. Conceptually, Uruk marked the moment when human society became self-referential. The city was not merely a cluster of dwellings, but a machine for administration, ritual, and record. Each artifact, from the humblest bowl to the grandest ziggurat, served a function within a unified logic of control. Civilization, in its recognizable form, had materialized. By 3400 BC, Uruk had assumed a rhythm of life so complex that its organization must have seemed as inevitable as the sunrise. Across its walled perimeter, mud-brick streets carried processions of traders, laborers, and priests moving between temple, workshop, and marketplace. Magnetometer surveys and excavation maps show a dense grid of lanes radiating outward from the Ina and Anu precincts, bordered by housing blocks of astonishing regularity. Within these blocks, rectangular rooms arranged around small courtyards reveal a concern for ventilation and privacy, evidence that urban design had transcended necessity to become an aesthetic discipline. Stratigraphic evidence of repeated resurfacing along major thoroughfares indicates civic maintenance, suggesting that collective labor extended beyond agriculture into infrastructure. The city itself had become a shared monument. At the heart of this monument, writing advanced from numerical notation to true language. Tablets from the Ina archive preserve lists of officials, temple personnel, and commodities expressed through a mixture of pictographs and phonetic signs. Paleographic analysis shows that around 3200 BC certain symbols ceased to represent things and began to represent sounds, allowing abstract concepts, names, actions, relationships to be recorded. This transformation marked a cognitive threshold. No longer confined to accounting, writing entered the domain of identity and memory. The earliest personal names inscribed in clay belonged to scribes and administrators, not kings. The implication is profound. The keepers of records were the first individuals to be remembered by name. Parallel to the rise of literacy came the diversification of economic space. Excavations along Uruk's northern sector exposed large courtyard buildings with rows of storage rooms and kilns, likely workshops under temple supervision. Thousands of clay ceilings recovered from their floors show distinct emblematic imagery, reeds, animals, architectural motifs, each identifying a specific office or department. Such standardized seal iconography implies a formal bureaucracy operating across the city's institutions. Administrative logic had replaced kinship as the binding fabric of society. Archaeobotanical remains illuminate the material scale of this system. Storage pits near the Ina precinct contained barley grains layered with chaff residues consistent with bulk handling rather than domestic storage. Measurements of these deposits yield volumes far exceeding household consumption, confirming state-level aggregation. Meanwhile, residues of dates, fish oil, and sesame discovered in large amphorae suggest dietary specialization and redistribution. Statistical analysis of grain impressions on tablets aligns closely with the measured capacities of these vessels, illustrating the mathematical integration of economy and record. For the first time, mathematics served not celestial observation, but civic management. The built environment reflected this precision. Monumental facades of temples and administrative halls were ornamented with cone mosaics arranged in rhythmic geometric patterns, diamonds, chevrons, and rosettes. The repetition of these motifs across multiple structures hints at a codified architectural language. As light struck the embedded cones, their polished surfaces shimmered like scales, producing a visual rhythm echoing the ordered lists on tablets. In Uruk, art became data rendered in color and form. Outside the city, canals extended like arteries, linking Uruk to neighboring settlements and distant trading posts. Aerial imagery and geomorphological mapping reveal that these waterways stretched for tens of kilometers, engineered with uniform gradients that maintained constant flow. Barges transporting grain, fish, and pottery along these routes, and their operations were recorded in the very tablets recovered from the city's archives. The riverine network thus functioned as both physical and administrative infrastructure, a system in which water and writing sustained one another. Conceptually, Uruk represented the triumph of abstraction over immediacy. Labor, language, and landscape were all mediated through systems of representation. Tokens became symbols, fields became figures on tablets, devotion became architecture. In this transformation, the city achieved something irreversible. Humanity had learned not merely to inhabit the world, but to describe and thereby to govern it. By 3200 BC, Uruk stood as the prototype of civilization, a living intersection of architecture, governance, and intellect. Within its walls, the relationship between labor and authority reached a new equilibrium. Administrative tablets from the Ina precinct record allocations of grain rations to thousands of workers, listed by occupation: reed cutters, brick molders, brewers, shepherds, scribes. These records, now preserved in museum collections, demonstrate not only the scale of employment, but the emergence of systemic accountability. Work was no longer measured by presence or lineage, but by output recorded in clay. The document replaced the overseer. Writing itself became an instrument of control. Archaeological excavation of industrial zones on the city's periphery reveals long rows of kilns and slag pits, confirming production on a scale unmatched in earlier settlements. Chemical analyses of copper residues and furnace slag show consistent temperatures near 1100 C, achieved through bellows technology that required coordinated labor and specialized knowledge. Textile workshops inferred from dense concentrations of spindle whorls and loom weights, suggest that women formed a large portion of the skilled workforce. Administrative texts corroborate this, listing female names in connection with wool production and bread rations. The organization of gendered labor was thus institutional, not domestic, a radical transformation in social structure. Trade extended Uruk's reach far beyond its irrigation basin. Isotopic tracing of lapis lazuli, diorite, and chlorite artifacts recovered from temple storerooms indicates imports from Afghanistan, Oman, and the Iranian plateau. Archaeological finds of Uruk-style bevel-rimmed bowls and cylinder seals across Syria and Anatolia testify to the city's cultural influence. This network, sometimes called the Uruk expansion, represented the earliest form of economic imperialism. Colonies established at Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda along the Middle Euphrates carried Uruk's architectural style and administrative system hundreds of kilometers from its core. The diffusion of seal motifs, brick sizes, and tablet scripts across these sites provides the first archaeological record of a standardized bureaucratic culture expanding through trade rather than conquest. Within the city, religious architecture mirrored political power. The Ina precinct underwent continuous renovation, each phase adding new courtyards and porticos. The layout of its final Uruk IV level reveals a deliberate choreography of movement, processional routes guiding participants from open plazas into increasingly restricted sanctuaries. This spatial hierarchy reinforced both theological and administrative control. Offerings moved inward, authority radiated outward. Excavations unearthed fragments of limestone reliefs depicting processions of figures bearing vessels, the first narrative scenes in Mesopotamian art. Their rigid symmetry and repetitive form reflect the same impulse visible in accounting tablets, the desire to classify, record, and perpetuate order. The development of cylinder seals intensified this culture of representation. Carved from hard stones such as serpentine and hematite, these small objects rolled across clay to leave continuous impressions of intricate designs, animals, deities, and ritual scenes framed by abstract patterns. Each seal functioned as a personal signature, a guarantee of authenticity. The earliest examples, found in administrative contexts, mark containers, doors, and documents, ensuring the integrity of transactions. The seal's aesthetic sophistication underscores a conceptual leap: art as authentication, image as authority. Meanwhile, the city's population required governance beyond temple administration. Archaeological evidence of large open squares and public halls suggests the existence of civic gatherings, perhaps assemblies of elders or officials. Although no textual record of law survives from this early period, the spatial organization implies collective decision-making. The temple may have managed resources, but social order depended on shared norms codified through ritual and precedent. The material record of these norms lies in repetition: the same house plans, the same bowl forms, the same brick dimensions, each replication an unspoken contract of civilization. Conceptually, Uruk reached beyond survival. It demonstrated that stability could be manufactured through systems of writing, of labor, of faith. In this equilibrium of clay and calculation, humanity discovered the architecture of continuity, the capacity to preserve intention beyond the life of its maker. By 3100 BC, Uruk had matured into a metropolis whose influence radiated across Mesopotamia. Excavations in its later strata, known to archaeologists as the Uruk III phase, expose a city fully articulated in both form and function. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, drainage systems tunneled beneath courtyards, and monumental gateways framed the approaches to the great temple precincts. Within the Ina complex, brick pavements worn smooth by countless processions still bear traces of reed mat impressions, the faint signature of ceremonial routes repeated for generations. Radiocarbon assays of charcoal from construction date the final monumental reconstructions to around 3100 BC, precisely the era when proto-cuneiform script reached maturity. The archives of this period constitute the oldest coherent bureaucratic corpus in human history. Over 5,000 tablets, retrieved from temple and administrative contexts, record the circulation of grain, livestock, textiles, and labor. Statistical analyses of their sign frequencies reveal a lexicon exceeding 1,000 distinct symbols, an embryonic writing system capable of expressing not only quantity, but relation and hierarchy. Sign groups denoting to deliver, to receive, and to allocate form the grammatical skeleton of the world's first economy of text. Here, record and reality fused. To inscribe was to enact. Excavations show tablets arranged in deliberate sequences within sealed rooms, implying storage by category and period. The archive itself was architecture, clay transformed into information space. Outside these sanctuaries of record, the city's noise told the same story of order. Workshop refuse mounds, kiln fragments, obsidian chips, bitumen lumps map a landscape of industry. In one zone, archaeologists uncovered parallel rows of kilns, each 20 meters long, their heat-reddened clay still streaked with ash. Chemical residue points to the mass production of molded bricks and ceramic containers, materials essential for the city's expansion. The scale of these operations demanded coordination across hundreds of laborers, each task documented on tablets listing rations of grain and beer. The temple no longer simply mediated between human and divine, it had become the manager of an urban machine. Artistic expression kept pace with bureaucratic precision. Stone stele fragments depict priests presenting offerings before towering shrines, rendered in shallow relief with rhythmic symmetry. A single surviving plaque from Uruk's inner precinct, its figures in strict profile, hands clasped in reverence, marks the first attempt at historical narration through image. The conventions established here would guide Mesopotamian art for 2 millennia. Hierarchy of scale, ritual procession, the divine enthroned above human petitioners. Through art, power found visual grammar. Uruk's external connections continued to widen. Archaeological parallels between its ceramics and those of Susa in Elam, as well as northern Syrian sites such as Tel Brak, show direct interaction along trade corridors spanning hundreds of kilometers. Radiogenic isotope analysis of copper artifacts confirms sustained import from the Omani highlands, while bitumen from Hit on the Middle Euphrates sealed the seams of Uruk's reed boats. These logistical feats required both engineering skill and diplomatic reach. The Uruk network, extending from the Gulf to the Levant, functioned as the earliest international system of exchange, a web of goods and ideas bound by shared symbols impressed on clay. At the conceptual level, the city had achieved something even greater, the invention of impersonal order. Authority no longer resided solely in a ruler's charisma or a god's presence, but in procedures that outlived both. The tablet, the seal, and the brick defined a new trinity of permanence. In them, intention became replicable. This was humanity's first experiment in systemic continuity, civilization understood as the repetition of rules rather than the endurance of individuals. By 3000 BC, Uruk had reached the apex of its early urban phase, a point where administration, architecture, and ideology converged into a single totality. Excavations reveal that the city's population may have exceeded 50,000, a density sustained by a precisely balanced system of irrigation and distribution. Survey data from the surrounding alluvial plain indicate an intricate lattice of canals radiating outward, each linked to storage depots and subsidiary hamlets. These settlements, some fortified, functioned as agrarian satellites feeding the metropolis. Sediment analyses confirm that these waterways were dredged regularly. Their maintenance demanded organized labor on a scale that only centralized authority could command. The city and its countryside formed a closed ecological circuit, an engineered landscape of dependence. Within Uruk, administrative complexity achieved institutional form. The Inner Precinct's archives, supplemented by similar finds in secondary temples, reveal bureaucratic specialization, tablets assigned to departments for livestock, textiles, and grain storage. Ceilings recovered from sealed doorways bear distinct emblems for each office, attesting to administrative compartmentalization. Archaeologists have reconstructed these seals into hierarchies of function, from high officials authorized to open storerooms to scribes responsible for tallying rations. The entire apparatus operated under the aegis of divine legitimacy. Inscriptions invoke Inanna's blessing upon transactions. In Uruk, theology and bookkeeping were one language. The material record reflects this integration. Across the city, standardization extended to nearly every object. Brick dimensions, jar volumes, and even door widths conform to measurable norms. Recent 3D modeling of surviving structures demonstrates that these proportions correspond to common modular units derived from field measures. The city was literally built on its own metrics. Measurement had become ideology, order its theology. The social landscape, however, remained fluid beneath this structure. Burial evidence shows both hierarchy and flux, elites interred with imported lapis ornaments beside more modest grave containing simple pottery. Tablets occasionally reference the misappropriation of goods, implying bureaucratic disputes or audits. Even in its perfection, the system revealed the first cracks of accountability, a tension between individual agency and institutional permanence. Civilization had invented its own contradictions. Art and ritual preserved coherence amid these tensions. Processional paths connecting the Inner Precinct to the Anu Ziggurat trace symbolic alignments with celestial bodies. Recent archaeoastronomical studies suggest that the main avenue oriented toward the heliacal rising of Venus, the planet sacred to Inanna. Thus, cosmology regulated urban geometry. At appointed festivals, thousands likely gathered to witness reenactments of divine marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi, a ritual mirroring the fertility cycles governing both agriculture and polity. The city's architecture and ritual calendar synchronized human rhythm with celestial order, sustaining collective belief in continuity. Beyond its walls, the Uruk world system spread this order through imitation rather than conquest. Sites across northern Mesopotamia and western Iran exhibit Uruk-style pottery, administrative seals, and even entire building layouts. Excavations at Habuba Kabira show orthogonal streets and bevel-rimmed bowls indistinguishable from those in southern Mesopotamia. Radiocarbon data align these colonies with Uruk's expansion between 3400 and 3100 BC. This diffusion marks the first documented cultural hegemony based on economic integration and ideological prestige. In every outpost, the symbols of Uruk, the bowl, the seal, the tablet, replaced local forms, standardizing the very idea of civilization. Conceptually, the city had crossed from experiment to precedent. Uruk demonstrated that complexity could be sustained through systems of information and belief, that symbols could govern as effectively as swords. From its streets and archives would descend the blueprint of all later states, the notion that society itself could be engineered, administered, and perpetuated through record and ritual. By the time the city of Uruk reached its full maturity, around 3200–3100 BC, a silent revolution was underway in the hands of its scribes. What had begun as simple impressions of tokens into wet clay, marks representing quantities of grain, jars of oil, or head of cattle, was evolving into the first written language. Archaeological strata from the Inner Precinct preserve hundreds of tablets from this threshold period, their surfaces crowded with pictographs pressed by reed styluses. Radiocarbon dating situates these proto-cuneiform records precisely at the point where administration required abstraction beyond the tangible. When a city manages thousands of workers and tons of grain, the memory of men becomes insufficient, only clay endures. The earliest tablets are pragmatic, almost austere. Their signs, shaped like miniature drawings, depict familiar objects: a fish, a loaf, a jar, a head of barley. Yet between 3300 and 3100 BC, their function shifted from direct representation to relational thought. Groups of signs began to indicate transactions: grain delivered to temple granary, beer allocated to workers. Numerical notations were standardized, inscribed in columns along the tablet's margin. The invention of place value, primitive but discernible, allowed sums to be tallied with accuracy independent of human memory. In these tablets lies the first architecture of thought external to the mind. Archaeological evidence from Susa, Jemdet Nasser, and Uruk itself confirms that this script spread rapidly along trade corridors. Comparative analysis of sign lists shows regional adaptations but shared structure, suggesting institutional schooling of scribes. At Uruk, fragments of clay exercises have been recovered, practice tablets bearing repeated signs, each corrected by overwriting. These are the world's earliest examples of formal education. Writing had created a new class: literate administrators who mediated between word and world. The medium itself shaped cognition. Unlike ink on parchment, clay demanded deliberate incision. Each stroke required pressure, rhythm, and sequence, each tablet a choreography of intent. The tool, a cut reed, imposed geometry on the fluidity of language, transforming curves into wedges. By 3100 BC, pictographs were no longer drawn but impressed, their outlines collapsing into stylized angles. This was not mere simplification, but conceptual refinement. The stylus abstracted thought from image, enabling writing to transcend depiction. Thus, the script became cuneiform, wedge-shaped, capable of expressing both quantity and idea. The tablets also reveal an early awareness of format. Many bear impressions of cylinder seals across their reverse sides, functioning as official authentication. The seal's iconography, a priest pouring libation, a herd passing through a gate, acted as visual punctuation, confirming the authority of what was written. Administrative order thus relied on dual technologies: text for data, image for legitimacy. Both were stamped into the same clay, coexisting as the twin alphabets of power. Conceptually, this period marks the separation of sign from thing, symbol from object. When a mark could stand for sound rather than shape, language itself became transferable. The scribes of Uruk, perhaps unknowingly, had redefined the human relationship to reality. No longer bound to presence, memory could exist in absence. Writing was not a mirror of speech, but a technology of permanence, a deliberate fossilization of information. In these early tablets lies the first human claim to immortality through record. By 3100 BC, the new system of signs had surpassed mere administration. It had become the instrument through which the Sumerians organized thought itself. The proto-cuneiform script now recorded verbs, relationships, and abstract categories. Excavations in the inner precinct revealed tablets divided into ruled columns, each line delineating subject, quantity, and transaction. This spatial arrangement of information, unique to the medium of clay, imposed hierarchy on meaning. For the first time, syntax had a physical form. Archaeologists examining these archives note that the layout of signs mirrors the arrangement of storerooms excavated nearby: rows, compartments, and sequences. Writing, it appears, was architecture translated into symbol. The scribes who maintained these tablets constituted an elite, unlike any before. Clay exercises found in refuse pits demonstrate rigorous training. Students practiced the same sign hundreds of times, occasionally accompanied by corrections incised by a supervising hand. Tablet typologies show that pupils advanced from simple numerical notations to complex lexical lists, precursors to dictionaries. One such list, the Standard Professions Text, enumerates hundreds of occupations, from brewer and potter to priest and scribe, providing a snapshot of Uruk's social structure. The text's order of entries, consistent across copies, reveals a taxonomy of labor that was both practical and ideological. By writing the world, the scribes defined it. Material studies of the tablets underscore their precision. Petrographic analysis of clay composition shows that scribes selected fine, silty sediments from specific riverbanks, sieved, and kneaded to uniform texture. Each tablet was sun-dried rather than fired, ensuring retrievability for correction and reuse. When an entry expired, after rations were distributed or debts settled, the tablet could be soaked and reinscribed. This impermanence within permanence mirrored the rhythms of urban life, administration as continuous renewal rather than static archive. The earliest numerical systems on these tablets employed two parallel notations, one for discrete objects and another for bulk commodities like grain or beer. Archaeomathematical studies confirm that each notation used different base values, 60 and 10 respectively, anticipating the sexagesimal system that would later govern Babylonian astronomy. The choice of base 60, perhaps derived from lunar cycles and agricultural calendars, fused cosmology with economy. Each calculation thus reflected both celestial rhythm and civic order. The Sumerians' mathematics was not abstract, it was a theology of measure. Parallel developments in visual art reinforce this intellectual transition. Cylinder seals from the late Uruk period depict scenes of weighing, measuring, and registering goods, often under divine supervision. In one famous impression, a priest stands before a balance scale flanked by deities, the pans perfectly level. The composition, though miniature, encapsulates the worldview embedded in the new script: equilibrium as justice, measurement as morality. The same conceptual symmetry appears in written accounts that equate honest weights with divine favor. Language and law were becoming intertwined. Outside Mesopotamia, the influence of Uruk script spread swiftly. Tablets discovered at Susa in Elam and later at Habuba Kabira along the Euphrates show identical sign inventories and numerical conventions. The uniformity suggests itinerant scribes or shared training centers disseminating the technology of record. Wherever these tablets appear, they mark the presence of organized surplus and bureaucratic oversight, the unmistakable signatures of urban civilization. Writing was no longer a regional curiosity, it was a transferable system of governance. Conceptually, the language of clay had achieved autonomy. Each sign, detached from its physical referent, functioned as an abstract entity that could be recombined endlessly. In that recombination lay infinite possibility, the capacity to imagine systems not yet built, laws not yet enacted, gods not yet named. The clay tablet thus became humanity's first mirror of the mind, a surface where thought left its impression and remained. By 3000 BC, the cuneiform script had reached a level of structural maturity that placed it among the most transformative inventions in human history. The Sumerians, through necessity rather than philosophy, had created a system capable of preserving information across generations with fidelity unmatched by oral tradition. Excavations at Jemdet Nasser, a site contemporaneous with late Uruk, produced hundreds of tablets whose inscriptions detail the distribution of beer, livestock, and textile output. Each entry follows a consistent grammatical pattern: object, quantity, recipient, and early syntax of economy. Statistical analyses of sign frequencies indicate standardization enforced across scribal schools. Such uniformity implies central oversight, perhaps a council of temple administrators or royal clerks, ensuring coherence of language and record. Writing had become an institution, not a craft. Archaeological evidence from later Uruk strata demonstrates the increasing use of complex compounds, where signs combine to express ideas no single pictograph could convey. The term Dingia, a star-shaped sign denoting divinity, began to precede the names of gods, signaling grammatical hierarchy within the script. Similarly, marks for house and grain merged to indicate temple granaries. These combinations marked the conceptual birth of abstraction, the realization that meaning could arise not only from symbol but from structure. In the press of stylus on clay, the Sumerians invented syntax, the invisible framework linking words, thought, and authority. The spread of writing reshaped every facet of urban administration. Excavations at Shuruppak and Adab, sites slightly later than Uruk, reveal archives containing contracts, labor tallies, and even proto-legal clauses governing property and debt. One tablet records the transfer of a herd from one official to another, witnessed by a seal impression depicting two figures clasping hands. In this fusion of text and image lies the embryo of law, documentation as proof, inscription as justice. From the scribe's tablet emerged the principle that legitimacy could be written, not merely declared. The physicality of writing also altered cognition. To press a stylus into damp clay demanded deliberation. Errors could be corrected only by smoothing and rewriting. This friction of process bred precision. Every sign carried weight, every surface limitation compelled economy. Linguistic studies of early Sumerian vocabulary suggest that brevity and parallelism, the hallmarks of later Mesopotamian prose, originated in the constraints of clay. Writing did not merely record thought, it disciplined it. At a material level, the technology matured rapidly. Styluses of varying thickness produced distinct scripts for different purposes, broad wedges for lists, fine points for narrative or ritual text. Tablets themselves diversified in size, small palm-sized records for accounting, large flat formats for monumental inscriptions. Some were enclosed within clay envelopes impressed with duplicate texts, preventing alteration, a primitive form of security document. These innovations reflect an acute understanding of medium as message. Meanwhile, the act of writing gained ritual significance. Iconographic scenes on cylinder seals depict scribes kneeling before deities, stylus in hand, as though transcription were divine service. Later Sumerian myths would describe the god Nabu as scribe of the heavens, but its roots lay here, in the sanctuaries of Uruk, where human scribes enacted cosmic order through record. The alignment of writing with sacred duty endowed the script with moral dimension. To falsify, a tablet was to offend the gods, who guaranteed measure and truth. Conceptually, the language of clay extended humanity's temporal reach. Each tablet bridged the gap between the transient and the enduring, converting fleeting transaction into immortal evidence. Civilization's memory had found its medium. Through these wedges, sound became shape, intention became record, and history itself began. By the centuries following 3000 BC, writing in Mesopotamia was no longer an experiment. It was an embedded institution shaping every rhythm of urban life. The scribal schools of Uruk, Nippur, and Kish operated as intellectual centers where literacy fused theology, mathematics, and law into a single curriculum. Clay tablets from these early adabas, or tablet houses, preserve exercises in both numeric and lexical form, lists of animals, metals, professions, and deities, alongside columns of numbers representing conversions between measures of grain, weight, and length. The repetition of such texts across sites demonstrates a standard pedagogy. Each student trained not merely to write, but to think through system, an education in order itself. Stratified layers of tablet debris surrounding these institutions confirm their daily activity. Discarded exercises, half-erased surfaces, and shards bearing traces of unfinished lines testify to generations of students mastering the discipline of clay. Many tablets display incised marks along the margins where teachers corrected stroke angles or sign proportions. Paleographic comparison shows that by 2900 BC scribes had internalized over 1,000 distinct signs, reduced gradually as semantic efficiency improved. The transformation from pictogram to wedge script was nearly complete. Each stroke had become code, each code an abstraction of the world. Writing's influence extended beyond administration into cosmology. Texts from late Uruk and early Gemdit Nasa strata introduce lists of deities arranged hierarchically, the precursors to later Sumerian pantheons. Their arrangement reflects the same classificatory logic evident in bureaucratic records, divine order modeled on civic order. The gods of writing, measurement, and water, Nisaba, Enki, stood at the apex, sanctifying the instruments of civilization. To record was to participate in divine reasoning. The clay tablet thus operated as both ledger and liturgy. Parallel to this intellectual ascent, the material record reveals growing integration of writing into private and domestic spheres. Small tablets found in residential compounds contain inventories of household goods and personal debts. Seal impressions accompanying these documents show individualized motifs rather than temple emblems, animals, plants, geometric designs. Authority had begun to diffuse. Literacy, though limited, was expanding beyond institutional confines into commerce and property. With it came the first written evidence of personal accountability. The written word could now define obligation between individuals, not just between citizen and temple. The technological durability of clay ensured that even mundane records outlasted their makers. Flood layers at Shurapak preserved tablets still legible after 5 millennia, their wedge strokes sharp beneath silt. Through accident, these archives became fossils of cognition, demonstrating how a medium intended for administration became the vessel of memory. The durability of clay outperformed parchment, papyrus, and even stone for informational density. The Sumerians had discovered a medium where impermanence itself was inscribed into permanence. At the conceptual level, writing reshaped humanity's sense of time. Oral cultures perceive history as cyclic, renewed through ritual. Written cultures impose linearity, a sequence of before and after. The Sumerians, by inscribing events and accounts, invented chronology, the idea that past decisions persist and accumulate. Tablets dated by regnal years or festival cycles marked the dawn of recorded time. From this, history began its long trajectory toward narrative. The language of clay thus represents more than invention. It marks a fundamental shift in human consciousness. Through these wedge impressions, thought achieved distance from speech, and society achieved distance from forgetting. In the silent storerooms of Uruk and Nippur, beneath layers of dust and centuries, humanity learned to speak to the future. By 2900 BC, the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Nippur, had entered a new epoch of political complexity. The Sumerian plain, once governed by temple administrators and collective councils, began to yield to a different principle of authority, the concentration of power in the hands of individual rulers. Archaeological evidence marks this transition not through battle debris or royal palaces alone, but through the administrative evolution visible in archives and architecture. The emergence of kingship was an extension of the bureaucratic logic perfected in Uruk, yet amplified by scale and sanctified by divine claim. Stratigraphic excavations across early dynastic layers reveal a decisive reorganization of space. In and Kish, large rectangular buildings distinct from temples appear for the first time, structures interpreted as palaces. Their walls, thicker and less ornamented than religious sanctuaries, surround open courtyards suitable for audiences or military musters. The earliest of these complexes, dated to around 2800 BC, yield administrative tablets, ceilings, and storage jars identical to those of temple archives. This overlap confirms that the palace did not replace the temple, but replicated its functions in a secular form. Kingship thus began as a mirror of priesthood, its legitimacy drawn from imitation of sacred order. Written records from this period preserve new administrative titles: Ensi, Lugal, and Sanga, terms denoting governor, king, and temple administrator. Their coexistence on tablets from sites such as Lagash and Adab demonstrates a transitional hierarchy in which civic and religious offices overlapped. The Lugal, literally big man, appears first as a military leader, perhaps elected in times of crisis. Over time, inscriptions shift from describing the Lugal as temporary commander to divine appointee, suggesting that emergency authority became institutional. Political centralization was not imposed by conquest alone. It was rationalized as cosmic necessity. The material economy of these early dynastic polities reveals how authority became sustainable. Excavations at the site of Tello, ancient Gersu, expose extensive networks of canals and fields organized into administrative units, each associated with a temple or noble household. Clay tablets from the same layers record field dimensions, labor assignments, and crop yields in meticulous detail. The granary system, already perfected in late Uruk, was now coordinated through palatial bureaucracy. Rations of grain and beer were distributed to laborers according to standardized measures, echoing the earlier bevel-rimmed bowl economy but under new supervision. Control of sustenance equaled control of people. Animal husbandry followed the same pattern. Tablets from Lagash list herds numbering in the thousands, divided among temple estates and royal flocks. Each herd was overseen by named officials responsible for output and breeding ratios. Seal impressions depicting flocks guided by attendants confirm the specialization of pastoral management. The Sumerian state was first and foremost an administrative ecology, its survival dependent on record and redistribution. Kingship emerged not as revolution, but as centralization of this machinery under a single will. Religious architecture reflected the new order. Temples continued to rise, but their dedications increasingly invoked royal patrons. At the ziggurat foundations from this era bear stamped bricks naming rulers who commissioned them. The act of building for the gods became both piety and propaganda. Through architecture, the king displayed divine partnership, human labor transforming mud into monument under celestial sanction. This collaboration between ruler and deity materialized the ideology of kingship, the assertion that human order mirrored cosmic order. Conceptually, the early dynastic city-state functioned as a triad: temple, palace, and field. The temple legitimized authority, the palace enforced it, and the field sustained it. Law and labor were twin expressions of the same logic: obligation recorded, measured, and enforced through writing. The rise of kings was therefore not merely political, but epistemological, the translation of divine command into civic code. Across the Sumerian plain, the consolidation of power around 2800 BC transformed not only political structure, but the texture of daily labor. Archaeological data from Lagash, and Adab show that thousands of workers were bound to temple and palace estates, their tasks inscribed on clay and verified by seal. Excavated archives at Tello preserve tablets listing precise allocations: 30 men for canal clearing, 10 women for weaving, 5 teams for plowing. Each entry is dated, signed by an official, and sealed with the emblem of the institution. These records attest to a managerial sophistication unparalleled in earlier history. The Sumerians had invented the scheduled workforce. Labor itself had become a measurable resource. Canal maintenance formed the core of this system. Without continual dredging, the arteries of agriculture would choke with silt within a single season. Stratigraphic cross-sections along the ancient Shat, Alhai, and Ichirungal canals reveal layers of re-excavation every few decades, visible as alternating sequences of occupation debris and flood deposits. These sediments, correlated with administrative tablets, show the rhythm of civic duty, a cycle of digging, planting, harvesting, and repairing. To manage such rotation, overseers kept tallies of tools, rations, and workdays. The earliest calendar texts from and Shurapak record seasonal divisions, 12 lunar months linked to specific agricultural tasks. From the need to synchronize labor and water arose the first temporal administration: time quantified for work. Social stratification deepened around this economic core. Burial evidence from Kish and displays sharp disparities in grave goods. Some individuals were interred with copper weapons, carnelian beads, and lapis inlays, while others lay with simple pottery. This hierarchy corresponds with textual categories of rank: awilum, free citizen; mushkenum, commoner; and wardum, servant. Although these terms reach formal definition only in later law codes, their conceptual roots appear here, in a society where labor and obligation were already encoded in record. The differentiation of status was not rhetorical, it was administrative. Archaeological traces of workshops further illuminate the scale of production that supported kingship. Excavations in the temple quarter of Gersu uncovered complexes of kilns, metal furnaces, and textile looms organized along narrow corridors. Chemical analyses of slag confirm systematic smelting of imported copper ores, while impressions on loom weights reveal standardized dimensions matching ration lists for spinners. Each workshop operated as an extension of the state, its workers compensated in grain and beer. In this setting, the boundaries between temple economy and government dissolved entirely. The temple accounted, the palace enforced, and both shared a single archive. The ideological dimension of labor appeared in art. Stone plaques from and Mari depict long processions of attendants carrying baskets of bricks atop their heads, each figure identical in posture and pace. These scenes, carved with repetitive precision, immortalize obedience as civic virtue. The same motif, rows of laborers ascending ramps with offerings or construction materials, reappears on cylinder seals and temple reliefs. It portrays work not as toil, but as participation in divine creation. The building of cities mirrored the creation of the world. Both required hierarchy, coordination, and measure. Conceptually, the linkage of law and labor defined early kingship. Authority derived from the ability to assign, record, and verify work in the name of order. The earliest known law fragments, though fragmentary, reveal decrees regulating water rights, crop boundaries, and work obligations. Justice was initially administrative rather than moral, the equitable distribution of labor and resource. The king's role was to balance these forces, to keep canals open, granaries full, and contracts honored. In that equilibrium, civilization found its first legal conscience. By 2700 BC, the city-states of southern Mesopotamia had matured into organized polities where kingship, law, and labor functioned as parts of a single administrative organism. Excavations at Kish, and Lagash reveal a consistent pattern: palatial complexes adjoining temples, shared storage facilities, and archives stacked with ration tablets. The physical closeness of these institutions indicates deliberate integration, governance, and worship entwined into a single bureaucracy. At Tello, ancient Gersu, one structure known to archaeologists as the Eninu precinct yielded over 1,000 tablets from sealed rooms, each inscribed with allocations of barley, oil, or textiles. Many carry the seal of Ernanch, one of the earliest named rulers of Lagash, who described himself not as conqueror, but as builder of temples. The phrase defines early kingship with precision: authority justified through service to the gods and regulation of production. The material culture of this period displays royal ambition rendered in engineering. Monumental canals, traceable through satellite imagery, radiated from each city toward shared agricultural zones. Survey data show their graded slopes maintained across kilometers, an achievement requiring mathematical planning. Inscriptions from later centuries would claim these canals as the work of divine kings, but the physical evidence speaks of coordinated communal labor, thousands of workers mobilized seasonally to keep the lifelines of grain and water intact. Kingship, in this context, emerged as the orchestration of collective survival. The ideology of labor permeated ritual life. Cylinder seals from and Adab depict kings offering libations, while attendants carry hoes and baskets, the same tools used in canal construction. The imagery equates manual work with sacred duty. In Sumerian myth, the gods themselves are said to have once dug canals and shaped clay before assigning that labor to humankind. Such myths, recorded centuries later, echo the economic realities already visible in this archaeological horizon. Divine hierarchy projected onto social order. The Lugal ruled because the cosmos required management, and work was its worship. Law as written record evolved from these same principles of measurement and duty. Administrative tablets from Shurapak include entries that verge on prescription rather than notation, directives about field boundaries, irrigation quotas, and repayment of seed loans. Though not codified in the later sense, these documents represent the embryonic form of civic law, rules grounded in the arithmetic of fairness. Disputes over water or harvest could be settled by tablet reference, not by testimony alone. The clay archive thus became both storehouse and courtroom, and the scribe a silent judge. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, the voice of kingship grew more declarative. Stone votive plaques, such as those dedicated by Enatum and Urukagina of Lagash, record early royal inscriptions in fully developed Sumerian script. Their lines blend administrative precision with ideological assertion. He dug the canal, he fed the people, he restored the temple. Each verb marks action as legitimacy. Excavated fragments of these texts still bear the wedge impressions of their original craftsmen, as if the king's authority itself were pressed into permanence. Through inscription, the deeds of rulers outlived the fragility of speech. Conceptually, this fusion of power and record transformed the nature of memory. For the first time, authority could cite itself not as myth, but as evidence preserved in clay. The law was no longer merely oral decree, it was artifact. The scribe's stylus had become the instrument of governance, and the king's monument the guarantor of continuity. Labor built the walls, writing secured the order, and kingship bound them both under the pretense of divine mandate. In this triad, civilization found its enduring logic: control through coordination, legitimacy through inscription, and permanence through stone and clay. By 2600 BC, Sumer's network of city-states had entered a phase of sustained political rivalry. Each center, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and claimed divine sanction for its ruler, yet all shared the same economic template: canal-based agriculture, temple redistribution, and written administration. Excavations in the early dynastic III levels at Lagash and show the institutional landscape at its most mature. Massive storehouses lined with buttressed walls contained cylindrical jars stacked in ordered rows. Adjacent rooms housed scribal benches, their floors littered with fragments of tablets and broken styluses. Here, overseers tallied rations for labor gangs, calculated brick quotas for construction, and recorded deliveries from distant estates. The rhythm of government was the scratching of stylus on clay. Tablets from these archives, translated and published in modern editions, display a bureaucratic vocabulary now fully stabilized. Units of measure, the gur of grain, the jin of silver, the shekel of weight, were standardized across the southern plain. The administrative reform that produced such uniformity required both political coordination and mathematical innovation. Sexagesimal notation, rooted in the old dual base of 60 and 10, enabled complex conversions between measures. The same arithmetic that once tallied grain would, centuries later, guide Babylonian astronomy. Even in its infancy, law was numerical. Fairness meant consistency, justice meant balance. Archaeological correlates of this order are visible in the granary complexes of Tello. Soil samples taken from storage floors show alternating layers of silt and carbonized grain, indicating regular renewal of stock. Wooden door frames, preserved as impressions in mud brick, carried seal impressions of high officials. Each seal's motif, a seated ruler receiving offerings, visually asserted that distribution itself was royal duty. Palatial iconography, thus reinforced administrative procedure. To feed the city was to reign justly. Yet beneath this surface of precision, competition for water and territory strained the fragile equilibrium. Clay inscriptions from Lagash record boundary disputes with neighboring Umma, culminating in skirmishes over canal rights. The so-called Stele of the Vultures, discovered at Tello, commemorates one such conflict. Its carved reliefs portray disciplined phalanxes advancing behind the ruler Inatum, their spears in geometric alignment. On the reverse, vultures carry the heads of the defeated, an unflinching record of violence rendered in the same measured style that governed temple accounts. War, too, was documented as administration. Inatum's inscription, among the earliest political manifestos in history, claims divine endorsement from the god Ningirsu. The text alternates between enumeration and theology, the lengths of canals restored, the fields reclaimed, the sacrifices offered. This blend of arithmetic and piety captures the essence of Sumerian kingship, order maintained through both ledger and altar. Archaeological surveys confirm that soon after his campaigns, the canals linking Lagash and Umma were re-excavated and widened, their embankments lined with new mud-brick retaining walls. Conquest was infrastructure by another name. The legacy of these rulers is preserved in their reform inscriptions. A century after Inatum, King Urukagina of Lagash recorded decrees limiting the exploitation of commoners by temple officials. Though fragmentary, his text outlines fixed grain dues, protection for widows, and the abolition of arbitrary fees. It represents the first known attempt to codify ethical governance. The fragments were found within a temple archive, suggesting that law itself remained housed under divine supervision. Urukagina's reforms, while local, signal the emergence of a concept that would define Mesopotamian civilization, the ruler as guarantor of justice rather than mere distributor of labor. Conceptually, the early dynastic world had achieved a complete political circuit. From collective labor arose administration, from administration, kingship, and from kingship, law. Each step converted necessity into ideology. By turning work into record and record into right, the Sumerians transformed survival into civilization. By 2800 BC, the cities of Sumer were no longer isolated islands in the alluvial plain. Canals, rivers, and the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf formed corridors of exchange, connecting them to regions hundreds of kilometers away. Archaeological residues, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, diorite from Iran, and carnelian from the Indus, testify to the widening horizon of Sumerian commerce. These materials, alien to the Mesopotamian landscape, appear in temple inventories and royal workshops, signaling not occasional trade but systematic procurement. The Sumerians, limited by their geography, turned dependence into innovation. Trade became not a luxury but a civic necessity. Excavations at the port of Ur provide tangible evidence of maritime activity. Beneath layers of silt, archaeologists uncovered quays lined with bitumen-coated bricks and fragments of boat timbers preserved in anaerobic clay. Radiocarbon dating places their use between 2600 and 2400 BC. The vessels, constructed from bundled reeds sealed with bitumen, were light yet durable enough to carry metal ingots and stone blocks along the Gulf's sheltered coast. Bitumen analysis reveals that much of it came from Hit, hundreds of kilometers upstream, indicating logistical organization across multiple city-states. Commerce required cooperation. No single polity could sustain such distances alone. Land routes complemented these maritime corridors. Survey data from Susiana, the plateau between Mesopotamia and Iran, reveal caravan traces, ruts, campsites, and small fortified outposts, marking paths that once connected Sumer to the copper mines of the Iranian highlands. Excavations at Tepe Yahia and Shardad have yielded Sumerian-style cylinder seals and accounting tablets, confirming the presence of scribes and merchants far beyond the Mesopotamian core. These agents, acting on behalf of temples and palaces, carried not only goods, but systems of measurement and record. The diffusion of writing and seal iconography across these regions reflects economic integration under administrative control. The arrival of bronze revolutionized this world. Metallurgical analysis of artifacts from Kish, and Mari indicates a deliberate alloying of copper with tin in proportions near 9:1, a combination that produced a harder, more resilient metal. Tin sources, absent in Mesopotamia, likely came from the Zagros foothills or beyond, perhaps even from Central Asia. The procurement of this metal required trade networks of unprecedented reach. Each axehead or chisel excavated in Sumer carries within it the geography of half a continent. The Bronze Revolution was, therefore, less a technological event than a logistical one, the first industrial supply chain in history. Archaeological strata confirm the economic consequences. Workshop debris in Lagash and Adab contains crucibles lined with copper and tin residues, slag heaps extending meters deep, and molds for tools and weapons. Radiocarbon sampling from associated charcoal indicates continuous operation over centuries. The surplus of bronze objects found in temple storerooms and Grave demonstrates production exceeding local need. Metallurgy had become both craft and currency. Bronze tools standardized labor, enabling deeper canals and larger temples. Bronze weapons standardized power, consolidating rule. The metal itself became a symbol of hierarchy, its sheen marking authority in both ritual and war. Conceptually, the Bronze Revolution altered humanity's relationship to material permanence. Stone had embodied endurance through mass. Bronze achieved it through transformation. The Sumerians, for the first time, learned to engineer durability, to fuse elements into a substance stronger than either alone. This act mirrored their civilization's own synthesis. City and field, temple and palace, record and reality alloyed into order. By 2600 BC, the reach of Sumerian commerce extended from the marshlands of the Persian Gulf to the mountain valleys of Anatolia and the Iranian plateau. Archaeological finds across this vast crescent confirm an intricate network of exchange, a system that joined raw material zones with urban consumers through predictable routes and contracts recorded in clay. Excavations at the site of Mari, strategically positioned on the Middle Euphrates, reveal storage halls filled with imported goods, copper ingots, shell jewelry, and lapis fragments packed in baskets sealed with cylinder impressions. Petrographic and isotopic studies trace these materials to origins hundreds or even thousands of kilometers distant, proving that Mesopotamian traders coordinated routes that crossed deserts and seas long before the age of empire. The logistics of such trade required unprecedented organization. Tablets recovered from and Lagash record consignments of copper and wood dispatched under official supervision. Each entry lists quantity, origin, and recipient, along with seals of attestation from temple merchants. These officials, known later as damgar, acted as agents of redistribution, intermediaries between the divine economy of the temple and the pragmatic world of exchange. Their ledgers show the earliest evidence of credit, loans of silver or barley advanced to caravan leaders, with repayment scheduled after the return journey. Commerce had moved beyond barter into finance. Maritime archaeology along the Arabian littoral adds another layer to this picture. Surveys off Kuwait's Failaka Island and Bahrain, ancient Dilmun, have uncovered harbor installations, anchors, and caches of bitumen-stained rope. Radiocarbon and thermoluminescence analyses place these remains within the same centuries that bronze began to circulate widely in Mesopotamia. Dilmun functioned as a crucial intermediary port, funneling copper from Oman's mines to Sumer's workshops. Cylinder seals found their combined Mesopotamian motifs with local iconography, human figures flanked by fish or palm trees, revealing cultural fusion through trade. The Gulf, once a geographical barrier, had become a conveyor of ideas and material. Within Sumer itself, the influx of metals transformed economic infrastructure. Archaeological residues from smithies at and Kish include molds for axes, adzes, and plow blades, their standardization visible in recurring measurements. Analytical chemistry identifies consistent alloy ratios, implying technical knowledge guarded by specialized guilds. The introduction of bronze tools accelerated every branch of production: agriculture, construction, and warfare. Fields could be tilled deeper, bricks shaped more evenly, canals dredged with less labor. Bronze, in effect, mechanized muscle. Its impact on social order was equally profound. Control over metal resources conferred new prestige on rulers and priests who organized procurement. Royal inscriptions from later centuries would remember these leaders as those who opened the mountains or those who brought copper from afar. The imagery reveals more than vanity. It acknowledges the geopolitical breadth of Bronze Age dependency. Political power was increasingly measured by access to distant ores. Culturally, the new mythology infused religion and art. Offerings lists from temple archives include bronze vessels for the gods, beside grain and incense. Statues excavated from sanctuaries at Mari and Nipur depict deities cast in shining metal alloys, their surfaces polished to mirror light like the sun they embodied. The fusion of copper and tin thus acquired symbolic dimension: unity, endurance, transmutation. The metal became metaphor for divine order itself, elements harmonized into perfection. Conceptually, the Bronze Revolution completed a cycle that began with writing. If script transformed thought into matter, mythology transformed matter into will. Both required heat, pressure, and precision, technologies of transformation born from patience. The Sumerians, through clay and bronze alike, discovered permanence not as stasis, but as control, the ability to reshape the earth in the image of intention. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, trade networks across Southwest Asia had become corridors of both material and cultural exchange. Archaeologists tracing lapis-bearing caravans from Afghanistan, copper routes from Oman, and timber traffic from Lebanon find identical sealing systems and weights. The same cone-headed cylinder seals that marked shipments in appear at Mari, Ebla, and even at settlements on the Iranian plateau. Each seal impression, a tiny imprint of a god, a king, or a sacred animal, functioned as an international signature. Commerce had created the first shared visual language between distant peoples. Workshops in southern Mesopotamia show how bronze remade daily life. Crucibles and molds from Lagash and Adab demonstrate large-scale casting of plowshares, chisels, and riveted blades, each standardized in proportion. Metallographic thin-section studies reveal alloy ratios so consistent that scholars infer centralized quality control, probably supervised by temple administrators. Bronze tools lengthened canal embankments, deepened irrigation basins, and enabled quarrying of harder stone for monumental construction. Every act of production left its trace: slag mounds, ash pits, and waste dumps that still ring ancient industrial quarters like geological strata of innovation. As technology expanded, so did documentation. Tablets from record the weighing of metal ingots, their conversion into finished goods, and their distribution to named officials. Beside these accounts appear references to merchant scribes, individuals who combined literacy with trade expertise. Through them, writing moved from temple sanctuaries into the marketplace. Business contracts, loans, and transport logs now bore legal force through clay. The economic world had acquired a bureaucracy of its own, mirroring the divine order once reserved for temples. The social geography of Sumer shifted accordingly. Port cities such as and Eridu thrived on Gulf traffic, their harbors filled with reed-hulled boats sealed in dark bitumen. Inland centers like Nipur and Kish functioned as administrative hubs where goods were taxed, weighed, and redistributed. Archaeobotanical residues of imported dates and spices attest to cosmopolitan diets unknown in earlier centuries. Excavators even find foreign ceramics and shell inlay within common dwellings, evidence that luxury had filtered downward through layers of society. Trade had democratized material beauty. Politically, these networks required security and standardization. The rise of regional alliances, loose coalitions under dominant kings, appears in inscriptions that list tribute from multiple cities. One fragment from Adab mentions metal of the mountains delivered as a royal due. Another from Lagash notes patrols guarding caravans against raiders. The state had extended its reach along the arteries of commerce, transforming wealth into policy. Conceptually, bronze and trade together embodied civilization's first model of interdependence. No city possessed all resources. Prosperity demanded coordination across landscapes and languages. The Sumerians learned that endurance lay not in isolation, but in exchange. Every ingot that reached Ur's workshops carried within it a chain of human cooperation stretching from desert mine to delta forge, a silent testimony to the web of relationships that defined the Bronze Age world. By 2500 BC, the commercial web linking Sumer to the wider ancient world had reached its fullest extension. From Anatolia to Baluchistan, evidence of Sumerian trade appears like scattered fragments of a vast, invisible map. Archaeologists at sites such as Susa, Mari, and Shortugai uncover artifacts unmistakably Mesopotamian in style. Cylinder seals carved with scenes of offering, standardized weights of polished hematite, and clay tablets bearing the wedge script of the southern plains. The diffusion of these objects marks the emergence of what historians call the First World System, a network of shared technology, measurement, and myth carried by caravans and ships alike. In the workshops of Ur and Lagash, bronze had become the defining medium of production. The steady flow of copper from Magan, modern Oman, and tin from the Iranian highlands allowed the alloy to replace stone and bone across nearly every tool type. Excavations reveal molds for blades, chisels, nails, and sickles stacked in ordered rows, while slag heaps several meters high ring the old industrial zones. Analytical studies show that furnaces operated at controlled temperatures, suggesting a level of technical discipline equal to later classical metallurgy. The repetitive rhythm of smelting, casting, and polishing transformed metallurgy from craft to industry. The social consequences of this industrialization ripple through the archaeological record. Bronze weapons and ceremonial axes found in elite Grave indicate the rise of a warrior class whose prestige derived from access to metal. Yet in temple archives, tablets continue to record labor quotas, deliveries, and contracts, evidence that production remained under bureaucratic supervision. Power flowed through supply chains rather than battlefields. Kings and priests managed trade expeditions as carefully as they once managed irrigation. Merchants and metalworkers were extensions of the state. The Sumerians had fused economy and governance into a single metallic order. Maritime discoveries reinforce this picture. Off the coast of Bahrain, ancient Dilmun, divers have recovered anchors carved from limestone and fragments of cargo jars sealed with Sumerian-style impressions. Bitumen residues on these jars match samples from Mesopotamian quarries, confirming two-way movement of goods, copper and ivory outward, textiles and grain returning. Dilmun's role as broker between Sumer, Magan, and the distant land called Meluha, likely the Indus Valley, is attested in cuneiform texts of later centuries, but grounded in this archaeological horizon. The Gulf had become a highway of exchange, its tides carrying not only cargo but ideas. In art, the symbolism of metal pervaded representation. Statuettes of worshippers from temple precincts, cast in bronze and inlaid with shell and lapis, depict figures with clasped hands and wide, reflective eyes. Their stillness conveys submission to divine order, yet their material, bronze alloyed from far-flung lands, embodies the unity of empire through exchange. Even devotion had acquired the sheen of commerce. Conceptually, the Bronze Revolution had achieved its apogee. Where clay had recorded thought, bronze enacted it. The alloy's mixture of strength and luster became the metaphor for civilization itself, the fusion of differing elements into enduring harmony. Through metallurgy and trade, Sumerians discovered the means to transcend their boundaries, binding riverine cities to mountains, deserts, and seas in a single continuum of production. The world, once divided by geography, had become a circuit of intention. Between 2600 and 1900 BC, while the Sumerian cities reached their zenith, another civilization flourished far to the east, along the floodplains of the Indus and Saraswati rivers. The Indus Valley Civilization, known today from sites such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and Lothal, emerged almost contemporaneously with late Sumer and in many respects mirrored its complexity. Yet where Mesopotamian power radiated through kingship and temple hierarchy, the Indus world expressed order through urban planning and civic uniformity. Archaeology reveals not imitation, but convergence. Two civilizations responding differently to the same questions of water, trade, and record. Excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro demonstrate the scale of this eastern counterpart. Both cities covered more than 200 hectares, their brickwork standardized to a uniform ratio of 1:4, identical across hundreds of kilometers. Streets followed precise cardinal orientations, lined with covered drains and wells spaced at regular intervals. Radiocarbon dating situates their mature phase between 2500 and 2000 BC, the same centuries that saw the last flowering of Sumerian culture. The symmetry of their layouts, confirmed by aerial mapping, suggests central coordination comparable to Mesopotamia's temple administration. Yet in the Indus cities, archaeologists find no palaces, no ziggurats, no lavish royal tombs. Authority, though pervasive, left no throne. Material parallels between the two civilizations reveal deep commercial ties. At Kish, and Lagash, cuneiform tablets mention merchants from Meluha, a term scholars identify with the Indus region. These texts record consignments of ivory, carnelian, gold dust, and exotic woods, materials native to the subcontinent. Excavations at Mesopotamian ports such as and Failaka have yielded Indus-style etched carnelian beads and stamped seals engraved with animals and script. Conversely, at Harappan coastal sites like Lothal, archaeologists discovered Mesopotamian cylinder seals, weights conforming to Sumerian standards, and a dockyard large enough to accommodate ocean-going vessels. The evidence points to sustained, bidirectional exchange spanning the Arabian Sea. Scientific analyses have refined this picture. Isotopic studies of copper artifacts from Harappan contexts show compositional matches with ores from Oman and Iran, regions within Sumer's trade sphere, implying shared procurement networks. Similarly, the shell industry at Mohenjo-daro employed Gulf species identical to those recovered in Sumerian jewelry. The two worlds were linked not only by goods, but by technology, identical bead-making techniques, parallel weight systems, and comparable administrative tokens. Each culture adapted the other's tools of precision to its own order. Culturally, however, the Indus civilization diverged sharply from Sumer's theocratic model. Urban excavations yield few monumental temples or statuary gods. Instead, artifacts emphasize household ritual, terracotta figurines, miniature altars, and bathing platforms. This diffusion of sacred space implies a civic religion embedded in daily life rather than centralized worship. Political power, too, seems dispersed. The absence of named kings or royal inscriptions contrasts with Sumer's obsession with lineage and record. The Indus world valued anonymity over proclamation, its order maintained through consensus rather than decree. Conceptually, the encounter between Sumer and the Indus exemplifies the plurality of civilizations' paths. Both mastered water, measurement, and trade, both developed scripts and urban networks, yet their expressions of authority diverged entirely. Where Sumer externalized power in monument and inscription, The Indus internalized it in plan and proportion. One civilization spoke through kings and tablets, the other through bricks and drains. Together, they reveal the twin possibilities of order, one declared, the other implied. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the flow of goods and ideas between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley had become an artery of Bronze Age globalization. Archaeological signatures of this contact appear with startling regularity. Indus carnelian beads unearthed in royal tombs at Ur, bitumen-sealed jars of Mesopotamian origin recovered from Lothal's dock, and shell bangles made from Gulf mollusks found at both ends of the route. Each artifact records a chain of transactions linking two civilizations separated by more than 2,000 kilometers of desert and sea. The mechanism that sustained this traffic was the maritime circuit of the Persian Gulf, a route that connected the ports of Dilmun, modern Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Meluha, the Indus. Excavations along these coasts reveal warehouses, berthing platforms, and seal impressions identical to those used in Sumerian trade. The Gulf was no longer a boundary, but an economic continuum, a saltwater highway of tin, timber, ivory, and lapis lazuli. Cuneiform tablets from Ur and Lagash make this relationship visible in writing. Merchants identified as men of Meluha appear as traders or ship captains delivering exotic cargoes. In one document, a Meluhan interpreter is recorded as receiving grain and oil, evidence that communities from the Indus region resided in Sumerian cities. Cylinder seals engraved with Indus script and iconography have been excavated in Mesopotamian contexts, confirming that these merchants brought their administrative practices with them. Conversely, at Harappan sites, Mesopotamian weights and designs appear integrated into local systems, implying mutual adaptation rather than dominance. The Indus script, still undeciphered, may itself reflect experimentation inspired by cuneiform without direct imitation, linear rather than wedge-shaped, suited to ink, and carving rather than clay impression. Trade goods moved with remarkable consistency. The staple exports from the Indus were carnelian, gold, ivory, cotton textiles, and timber, resources abundant in the subcontinent but scarce in Mesopotamia. In return, Sumer provided silver, wool, and crafted metal tools. Archaeochemical analyses of residues inside ancient jars at Lothal suggest that they once contained sesame oil, copper ore, and perhaps fermented beverages. The scale of exchange implies organized caravans and fleets rather than occasional barter. Estimates based on tonnage capacities of reed and plank boats suggest voyages carrying loads exceeding 2 tons each, sufficient to support commercial profit across long distances. The economic framework of this relationship required standardized measurement. Both civilizations employed decimal weight systems anchored to small cubical stones, often of chert or jasper. Comparative metrology demonstrates that the Harappan unit of approximately 13.6 grams closely matches the Mesopotamian shekel, suggesting either direct influence or shared calibration through trade. Similar correspondences occur in length measures derived from brick dimensions. These parallels, verified through physical measurement of artifacts, demonstrate that cross-cultural contact extended beyond exchange of goods to harmonization of systems, an early international standardization driven by commerce. Despite such convergence, cultural philosophy diverged sharply. Mesopotamian civilizations celebrated the visible instruments of power, temples towering over plains, inscriptions proclaiming kings, archives documenting every ration. The Indus world, by contrast, left silence in stone, no royal names, no heroic conquests, no explicit theology. Yet its urban order testifies to an implicit discipline equal to any royal decree. The grid of Mohenjo-Daro, the reservoirs of Dolavira, the precise ratios of Harappan brickwork, all reveal governance expressed through structure rather than proclamation. Conceptually, the dialogue between Sumer and the Indus reveals that civilization does not require uniform ideology to achieve shared function. Through trade, each culture mirrored the other's strengths: Mesopotamia's capacity for articulation and the Indus' genius for coordination. Their exchange demonstrates that complexity can be both spoken and silent, that the measure of civilization lies as much in equilibrium as in expansion. By 2500 BC, the connection between Sumer and the Indus had matured into a steady rhythm of mutual dependence, a circuit where every voyage reinforced a delicate economic balance. The two civilizations stood as distant mirrors, each reflecting the other's mastery of environment and order, yet each embodying distinct conceptions of authority and value. Archaeological and textual evidence from both sides of the Arabian Sea shows that by this time, exchange had become institutionalized, not episodic. Sumerian port records, found in the later archives of Ur and Uruk, list regular deliveries from Meluhha, often accompanied by phrases denoting tribute or partnership. The language of these documents, formulaic and administrative, suggests that the trade was mediated by official envoys rather than freelance merchants. In this, commerce had already entered the domain of diplomacy. At Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the archaeological signatures of these exchanges manifest in objects of foreign technique but local purpose. Copper blades with Mesopotamian alloy ratios have been recovered from residential areas, indicating technological adoption. Conversely, pottery fragments bearing Indus motifs appear in temple contexts at Lagash and Ur, suggesting that imported items were integrated into ritual life. Such finds highlight an important distinction. Sumer absorbed foreign goods into sacred display, while the Indus incorporated external technology into daily utility. In both, cultural identity was maintained through adaptation, not exclusion. Scientific studies of ancient DNA and isotopic compositions further deepen this picture. Human remains from coastal Oman and Bahrain show mixed ancestry profiles consistent with migration between Mesopotamia and the Indus region. Strontium isotope analyses of tooth enamel confirm that individuals buried in Gulf settlements were born in diverse geological zones, some matching the signatures of the Indus plains. This bioarchaeological data transforms trade from abstraction into movement of people. Sailors, interpreters, craftsmen, and envoys linking distant cultures through lived experience. The early 3rd millennium BC thus witnessed the first diaspora of recorded history, a maritime community whose language was measurement, whose passport was the seal. The continuity of design between Sumerian cylinder seals and Harappan stamp seals provides an aesthetic testimony to this fusion. Both served administrative ends, yet their forms reveal philosophical difference. The Mesopotamian seal, rolled to produce continuous narrative scenes, celebrated movement and story. The Indus seal, impressed once, emphasized symmetry and containment. One depicted the dynamic of transaction, the other the equilibrium of record. Together, they symbolized two complementary visions of order, one extroverted and declarative, the other introspective and systemic. Infrastructural parallels extend the comparison further. Both civilizations engineered water as architecture. In Mesopotamia, the canal defined territory and hierarchy. In the Indus cities, the drain defined domestic hygiene and collective welfare. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro reveal brick-lined sewers running beneath major streets, connected to household baths with corbelled covers, an urban plumbing system unrivaled until the Roman era. In the Sumerian cities of Ur and Lagash, contemporaneous canals served transport and irrigation rather than sanitation, illustrating divergent priorities shaped by geography. Yet the underlying logic remained identical: mastery of water as the foundation of urban order. Conceptually, the Sumer-Indus connection marks the earliest instance of synchronized civilizations, distinct centers bound by exchange, yet sustained by parallel rationalities. Both demonstrated that urbanism could emerge wherever humans learned to discipline water measure labor, and preserve memory. Their interaction did not produce a single empire, but something subtler, a shared language of administration and craft that would outlast both cultures. The Bronze Age world had become a continuum of ideas traveling faster than armies, carried on the tides of trade and the rhythm of the stylus. By the final centuries of the 3rd millennium BC, the Indus-Mesopotamian relationship reached its quiet zenith, not as conquest or colonization, but as equilibrium sustained through routine. The evidence of this maturity lies less in monuments than in minutiae. The repeated impressions of seals, the standardization of cargo jars, the replication of weights and measures across two worlds. Archaeologists describe this horizon as the most stable long-distance economy of the Bronze Age. For over 4 centuries, ships traversed the Gulf, bearing metals and stones, grains and textiles, but also carrying something more durable, systems of reliability. Cuneiform records from now housed in museum collections, offer glimpses of the final vitality of this exchange. In one tablet dated to around 2050 BC, a merchant lists copper from Magan, lapis from Meluhha, and wood from Dilmun, all entered into the accounts of a temple workshop. Another text mentions a translator specifically titled the Meluhha Interpreter, proof that the trade had generated its own class of cultural mediators. These intermediaries, though unnamed, were the silent architects of the first transoceanic bureaucracy. Their expertise lay not in language alone, but in equivalence, in knowing how to translate weight, value, and trust across societies that never shared gods or kings. Meanwhile, in the Indus cities, the archaeological layers corresponding to this era reveal prosperity rather than strain. Mohenjo-Daro's brick pavements were repaired multiple times, suggesting sustained civic maintenance. Bead workshops in Harappa continued to produce carnelian and agate ornaments with the same technical mastery seen centuries earlier. At Lothal, the great dockyard remained in operation. Its silted floor retains faint scoring from mooring ropes, evidence of ships docking and departing long after Mesopotamia began its political decline. Trade endured even as empires changed. Yet environmental shifts were already altering the balance. Geological cores from the Indus Delta show progressive aridification after 2100 BC, the rivers migrating eastward, the monsoon weakening. Simultaneously, southern Mesopotamia suffered from salinization of fields and the fall of the Ur-Iii dynasty. The two civilizations, bound by commerce and water, declined through the same element. Their networks contracted as harbors silted and canals failed. Excavated settlements along the Gulf show abandonment layers marked by windblown sand and domestic refuse, abrupt halts in once flourishing trade. Even in decay, their influence persisted. The Indus tradition of precise brick ratios survived in later South Asian cities. Mesopotamian accounting systems endured in Babylonian archives. Archaeological typologies demonstrate the diffusion of Indus-style etched beads and Sumerian cylinder seals across later cultures, lingering traces of a dialogue once conducted through objects rather than words. In every fragment of polished carnelian or inscribed clay tablet lies a memory of mutual recognition, two civilizations acknowledging each other's existence through the grammar of exchange. Conceptually, their relationship represents the first proof that distance need not preclude coherence. The Sumerians and the Indus peoples created a continuity of function without a continuity of rule, a rare achievement in human history. Their parallel civilizations, though separated by geography and language, converged through discipline, the shared conviction that order could be built, measured, and maintained. When their rivers shifted and their cities fell silent, what endured was the template they had unknowingly composed together, the pattern of a connected world. By 2100 BC, the great arc of the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Plain had entered a period of contraction. The twin engines of Bronze Age order, irrigation and trade, began to strain against ecological and political limits. Across southern Mesopotamia, layers of windblown dust intermingle with abandoned canal beds, while in the Indus Valley, sediment cores record shifting river courses and declining flood intensity. Civilizations built upon water now faced its withdrawal. Archaeology documents not a cataclysm, but a drawn-out reconfiguration, a slow-motion erosion of systems once thought immutable. In Mesopotamia, the signs of stress first appear in the archives of the late Ur-II dynasty, around 2050 BC. Administrative tablets from Ur and Drehem, once abundant with shipments and rations, begin to show irregular deliveries and dwindling stockpiles. Grain accounts mention smaller harvests and higher salinity in fields, a condition confirmed by modern soil analysis, which detects sodium levels up to 5 times those of earlier strata. As irrigation expanded unchecked, the groundwater table rose, depositing salts that rendered the soil infertile. The same canals that had fed civilization now poisoned it. By the end of the dynasty, entire tracts of farmland lay fallow, their embankments collapsing into dust. Political fragmentation accompanied environmental decline. Excavated inscriptions from Isin, Larsa, and Eshnunna reveal a patchwork of successor states competing for control of dwindling resources. Monumental buildings slowed, bricks reused from older structures bear traces of prior dedications, evidence of economic austerity. In the royal archives of Ur, the last kings boast less of construction and more of restoration, repairing, not creating. The tone of these inscriptions, restrained and pragmatic, signals an awareness of fragility. Civilization had entered its reflective phase. At the same time, population movements reshaped the peripheries. Archaeological surveys in northern Mesopotamia and Syria record the arrival of pastoral groups often labeled Amorites. Their camps, visible as clusters of shallow hearths and animal pens, appear along river corridors once dominated by settled farmers. To the south and east, Elamite incursions disrupted trade routes linking Sumer to the Iranian plateau. Excavated tablets from the final years of Ur list emergency grain requisitions for garrisons and administrative tallies of refugees resettled within city walls. The bureaucratic precision remained, but the abundance it measured was gone. The collapse of the Sumerian system did not erase its knowledge. The scribal schools of Nippur and Ur continued to copy lexical lists, legal formulas, and hymns long after their cities' political independence had ended. Stratigraphic excavations at Nippur show uninterrupted scribal activity into the Old Babylonian period. Clay tablets bearing older Sumerian texts were recopied in newer Akkadian script, preserving the intellectual core of the vanished world. Writing had become civilization's immune system, preserving identity amid disintegration. Meanwhile, to the east, the Indus Valley faced its own transformation. Sediment analysis along the Gagahakra and Indus rivers reveals a shift in hydrology beginning around 2000 BC, channels migrating eastward, floods becoming less predictable, and the once life-giving monsoon weakening. Radiocarbon dates from Harappan sites show gradual abandonment rather than sudden destruction. Mohenjo-Daro's upper layers contain evidence of rebuilding on a smaller scale, streets narrowed, drainage less maintained. At Lothal, the great dockyard filled with silt, its floor coated by a layer of fine clay deposited by stagnant water. The same precision that once defined the Indus cities now eroded into improvisation. Archaeologists find signs of decentralization, new settlements appearing farther east into the Ganges plain, pottery styles diversifying, weights and measures losing their standard ratios. The uniformity that had been the hallmark of the Indus world dissolved into regional variety. No invading armies are evident, no mass burials or burned fortifications. The collapse was systemic, not violent, a slow unspooling of coordination as water and trade withdrew. Conceptually, these twin declines reflect the paradox of early civilization. The very systems that secured stability contained the seeds of their undoing. Irrigation led to salinization, centralization to rigidity, trade to dependency. The precision that once defined Sumer and the Indus could not adapt quickly to environmental flux. Their collapse was not failure, but transition, a transformation of scale and rhythm from monumentality to survival. Across the Mesopotamian plain, the withdrawal of water and wealth forced a redrawing of human geography. Excavations along the Tigris and Euphrates valleys reveal layers of abandonment alternating with brief reoccupation, a pattern of contraction towards sites that still controlled viable canals. Small communities, once dependent on temple redistribution, now relied on family labor and localized exchange. The monumental architecture of Sumer gave way to modest domestic compounds, their bricks recycled from ruined ziggurats. Archaeological surface surveys around Uruk show that by 1900 BC, the city's population had fallen to a fraction of its former size. What remained were pockets of persistence, shrines maintained by small priestly households, scribal workshops copying older texts, and craftsmen repurposing bronze for agricultural tools rather than ornament. Material evidence from this era reveals adaptation rather than collapse. Soil cores near Nippur contain layers of mixed silt and ash, indicating deliberate burning to reclaim salt-poisoned fields. At Lagash, newly cut feeder canals show attempts to redirect fresher water from upland tributaries. These local innovations, recorded in the sediment rather than in text, illustrate the resilience of human systems even amid environmental stress. Civilization contracted, but it did not vanish. Politically, the vacuum left by the fall of Ur-II invited the rise of new centers. In the north, the Amorite dynasties of Isin and Larsa revived fragments of Sumerian administration under new languages. Their rulers adopted the scribal conventions of the past, seal motifs, legal formulas, and building dedications as instruments of legitimacy. Tablets from Isin mention the repair of canals originally dug under earlier kings, showing that continuity remained the surest claim to authority. Each successor state styled itself as restorer rather than innovator, an echo of the belief that order existed only when measured against inherited record. Culturally, the transition marked the ascendancy of Akkadian over Sumerian as the language of daily administration. Yet the older tongue survived in education and ritual. Lexical lists, hymns, and proverbs copied by apprentices in Babylonian schools preserved the cadence of Sumer's speech long after its people had merged into later populations. In this textual afterlife, the Sumerians ceased to be a polity and became a memory, the first civilization to understand itself as a past. The act of remembrance, institutionalized through writing, ensured that collapse did not equate to oblivion. Archaeological silence that follows in many sites speaks less of disappearance than of dispersal. Pottery typologies show regional diversification, indicating mobility and adaptation to new ecological niches. Communities relocated along fresh watercourses, founding towns that would later feed the empires of Babylon and Assyria. Genetic and linguistic evidence suggests continuity rather than replacement. The same riverine families speaking evolved dialects, building on older foundations. Civilization had liquefied, flowing into new channels carved by necessity. Conceptually, the pattern of Mesopotamian transformation demonstrates that decline can be a form of preservation. The institutions that had once commanded cities, the scribe's tablet, the surveyor's cord, the priest's ritual, became portable technologies carried by migrants and reused in smaller contexts. The essence of Sumer survived not in its walls, but in its methods, the belief that order could be written, measured, and rebuilt. Through this migration of ideas, the first civilizations seeded all that would follow. By 1900 BC, the landscape that had once glowed with the lights of Uruk and was subdued but far from barren. In the archaeological layers of these ancient capitals, weeds grew through broken pavements while flocks grazed where scribes once tallied grain. Yet across the alluvial plains and foothills, life reassembled itself in new patterns. Excavations at Isin, Lhasa, and Babylon show the emergence of smaller but vigorous kingdoms that inherited the infrastructure of Sumer and adapted it to new circumstances. Their kings issued decrees in Akkadian rather than Sumerian, but their legal clauses and temple foundations remained modeled on the older world. Each clay tablet of the early Old Babylonian period bears the unmistakable grammar of continuity, the date formula citing a ruler's act of construction, the administrative column listing precise rations, the seal impression guaranteeing truth. The Sumerian method had become Mesopotamian instinct. Archaeological soil samples confirm partial recovery of agriculture. Fields abandoned during the high salinity phase were reclaimed through fallowing and the diversion of fresh water from northern canals. Botanical remains of barley and emmer appear again in storage jars after a century of absence, evidence that irrigation engineering, though simplified, had regained equilibrium with the environment. This recalibration was less dramatic than the grand hydraulic schemes of III, but more sustainable. Civilization, chastened by experience, had learned moderation. Culturally, the collapse fostered introspection. Clay tablets of the period record laments and hymns mourning fallen cities, the lament for the lament for Eridu. Their lines, preserved on baked fragments in museums today, describe temples deserted by gods, canals choked with silt, and people wandering in exile. Yet beneath their grief lies a subtle triumph, the recognition that memory itself could redeem ruin. By writing loss, the Sumerians transformed disaster into literature. Archaeologically, the copying of these laments continued for centuries, found in contexts as late as 1500 BC, proving that remembrance became ritual. The past had become an object of study, not merely nostalgia. The Indus world underwent a similar transformation of dispersal and survival. After 1900 BC, major cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa dwindled, but hundreds of smaller settlements appeared along new river courses in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and the Upper Ganges. Excavations reveal continuity in pottery design and house plans, though without the strict standardization of the mature phase. Faunal remains show increased reliance on cattle and millet rather than wheat and barley, reflecting adaptation to drier climates. The script and centralized authority vanished, but the habits of water management, craft specialization, and trade persisted in reduced scale. The civilization dissolved into its components without losing its knowledge. Across both regions, the Bronze Age ended not with annihilation, but with diffusion. The technologies of writing, metallurgy, and measurement spread outward, taken up by emerging peoples who never knew the cities that invented them. Archaeologists trace Sumerian cylinder seal motifs into Elamite and Hittite art, while Indus bead styles appear in Central Asian grave. The continuity of form testifies to the durability of idea. Each migration, each adaptation, was a rephrasing of the same sentence, that order could be built even after ruin. Conceptually, the twin collapses of Sumer and the Indus mark civilization's first conscious transformation. Humanity learned that endurance depends less on permanence than on replication, that knowledge survives by changing shape. The rivers shifted, the cities sank, but the grammar of civilization remained, carried in every tablet, tool, and brick reborn elsewhere. When the walls of crumbled and the temples of Eridu fell silent, it was the scribes, not the kings, who ensured that Sumer did not vanish. Around 1900 BC, the art of writing, refined through 1,000 years of administration, became the instrument of remembrance. Archaeological excavations at Nippur, and Sippar reveal layers of clay tablets deliberately stored and recopied long after their original purpose had expired. Some bear colophons statting for the teaching of the scribes, others notes of correction or commentary. In these quiet archives, civilization survived as curriculum. The scribal schools, known to later Akkadians as Edubas, tablet houses, formed the intellectual infrastructure of the post-Sumerian world. Excavated compounds at Nippur and Uruk contain benches, inkwells, and heaps of discarded clay fragments inscribed with repetitive exercises. Each student began by copying simple lexical lists, names of professions, animals, and plants. From there, they advanced to proverbs, hymns, and royal inscriptions. Archaeological typologies show that certain standardized tablets recur across centuries, confirming a formal syllabus. Education had become the final continuity of empire. Among the most revealing artifacts of this continuity are the lexical lists, vast compendia of words and signs. The standard vocabulary of Nippur, for example, catalogues thousands of terms, tools, metals, body parts, cities, arranged in systematic order. These lists, inscribed in Sumerian but annotated in Akkadian, functioned as both dictionary and encyclopedia. Their precision reveals an intellectual ideal, knowledge as classification. Every object in the world could be written, every category contained within cuneiform wedges. Through enumeration, the scribes reasserted control over a world that had fragmented. Tablet layers from the early Old Babylonian period, circa 1800 BC, show the endurance of this scholastic labor. Excavations in Nippur's scribal quarter uncovered nearly 30,000 fragments from a single stratum, proof of industrial-scale copying. Many tablets are duplicates of older Sumerian compositions, rewritten in slightly updated script. These copies demonstrate not nostalgia but pedagogy. To write the past was to internalize its logic. The scribes of Babylon and Larsa considered themselves heirs, not innovators. Their devotion to preservation transformed history into discipline. Material analysis adds further insight. Microscopic examination of these tablets reveals fine-grained clay sourced from controlled pits, tempered with chaff for flexibility. The evenness of texture and curvature of tablet edges show that scribes employed molds to standardize size. Each piece was thus both document and artifact of process. The uniform tablet shape, repeated across centuries, stands as a symbol of intellectual continuity, the geometry of thought made tangible. The content of scribal education reached beyond language into science. Lists of astronomical observations, mathematical tables, and metrological conversions appear among literary texts. One tablet from Sippar calculates the area of irregular fields using formulas expressed in sexagesimal fractions. Another lists coefficients for brickmaking, indicating how many workers were required per 100 bricks. Knowledge, once restricted to temple administration, had become portable expertise. The scribes were engineers of abstraction, able to transform observation into number into law. Conceptually, the persistence of the scribal tradition demonstrates that civilization's deepest continuity lies not in monuments, but in minds trained to replicate them. The brick may crumble, but the formula for its making endures. Through their clay syllabi, the scribes ensured that Sumer's methods, its mathematics, its language of measure and record, would seed every culture that followed. The scribes of the early 2nd millennium BC inhabited a paradoxical world. Their civilization had fallen, yet their language had become sacred. In classrooms across Babylon, Larsa, and Mari, apprentices pressed styluses into wet clay, learning Sumerian words for cities that no longer existed. Excavated exercises from these adubas read like epitaphs of empire, lists of temples in ruins, names of long-dead kings, river courses that had shifted beyond recognition. Yet in the act of copying, students revived them. Archaeology reveals this process vividly. At Nippur, layers of discarded school tablets form literal mounds of memory, broken lines of proverbs, hymns, and administrative phrases, each fragment a syllable of a lost world preserved through repetition. Sumerian, once a spoken language, had by 1800 BC become an academic medium, the Latin of the Bronze Age. Its grammar, frozen in textbooks, survived for another 1,000 years as the language of learning, religion, and law. Bilingual tablets from this era pair Sumerian columns with Akkadian translations, demonstrating a deliberate pedagogy of continuity. Through such documents, scribes trained to bridge past and present. The same lexical lists copied at Nippur were reproduced at Mari, Ugarit, and even distant Hattusa in Anatolia. Each copy extended the cultural geography of Sumer without the need for conquest. Among the texts most frequently copied were hymns and laments. Archaeologists recovering them from temple ruins note their formulaic phrasing and musical notation, rows of repeated syllables marking cadence. The Lament for one of the earliest surviving works of world literature, appears on tablets spanning several centuries and sites. Its refrain, "The storm took the city, its people were scattered," was both elegy and lesson. By writing grief, the scribes transformed historical loss into ethical reflection. The laments taught that divine favor was conditional on justice and that neglect of order invited ruin. In this way, literature became moral infrastructure, preserving the psychological architecture of Sumer long after its bricks had eroded. Scientific tablets from the same strata demonstrate how intellectual legacy expanded into new domains. At Sippar, collections of astronomical observations charted the movements of Venus and the Moon, correlating them with ritual calendars. Clay fragments from Uruk preserve multiplication tables and geometric problems. One computes the volume of a stepped temple tower, perhaps to calculate brick requirements. The notation system, sexagesimal, positional, and precise, would later inform Babylonian astronomy and, through Greece, the measurement of time itself. Each mathematical tablet is a relic of pure reasoning extracted from administration, abstracted into universality. Even mundane administrative tablets, loan records, property sales, labor contracts, reflect the durability of scribal logic. Formulae developed in Sumerian archives continued unbroken in Akkadian legal documents. The clause of witness, the seal impression, the list of guarantees. The consistency of form across a millennium reveals that literacy had become law's foundation. Archaeologists find these tablets stored in clay envelopes sealed and countersigned, the earliest manifestation of archival integrity. The very concept of the document as proof, the written contract as instrument of justice, descends from this continuity. Conceptually, the legacy of the scribes redefined the meaning of civilization. For the first time, knowledge was not an ornament of power but its substitute. The kings of later ages could fall, yet the scribes, anonymous, methodical, enduring, ensured that the logic of order outlived its rulers. In the quiet rhythm of stylus and clay, humanity discovered the principle of cultural immortality, that memory, once written, could surpass the life of empires. By the later Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, the intellectual inheritance of Sumer had been fully naturalized into the fabric of the Near East. Archaeological layers from Nippur, Sippar, and Mari show scribal households functioning as hereditary guilds. Rooms arranged around central courtyards contain benches, styluses of reed and bone, and small storage jars filled with the fine, silty clay favored for school tablets. In one residence at Nippur, excavators uncovered more than 800 inscribed fragments stacked in deliberate order, lexical lists, bilingual vocabularies, and mathematical tables, evidence that entire families maintained private archives of instruction. Knowledge had become property, curated, and transmitted through generations. The reach of this education extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Excavations at Ugarit on the Levantine coast and at Hattusa in Anatolia reveal cuneiform libraries containing Sumerian and Akkadian texts copied centuries after their origin. The Hittites, who spoke an Indo-European language, nonetheless trained their scribes in Mesopotamian methods, using wedge signs to write treaties, rituals, and royal annals. Clay archives from Ebla, dating to the 3rd millennium BC but rediscovered intact, confirm that this transmission began early. Across the entire Near Eastern corridor, the stylus unified cultures that shared neither speech nor gods. The shape of writing, became a lingua franca of governance. Within Mesopotamia itself, the scribal vocation diversified. Tablets recovered from temple complexes at Uruk and Sippar include hymns, omen collections, and lexical catalogues alongside administrative texts. The division between practical and speculative knowledge blurred. Astronomers, exorcists, mathematicians, and jurists all identified themselves as Dubsar scribes, heirs of the same tradition that once recorded grain and rations. Their archives contain instructions for diagnosing illness, interpreting dreams, and calculating eclipses. The clay tablet had evolved from bureaucratic tool to instrument of inquiry. The scribal worldview is evident even in the earliest law codes. The Code of Ur-Namma, ca. 2100 BC, and later the Code of Hammurabi, ca. 1750 BC, translate the logic of accounting into ethics. Each clause functions like an entry in an administrative ledger: condition, consequence, measure. Archaeological reconstructions of Hammurabi's stele show its text organized in columns resembling a tablet's ruled lines, the visual continuity unmistakable. Justice, like trade, was to be standardized, verified, and recorded. The impulse behind Mesopotamian law was scribal, to make conduct as calculable as grain. Meanwhile, the aesthetics of writing achieved permanence in stone. Cylinder seals carved with minute inscriptions multiplied throughout the region, their imagery blending mythic scenes with lines of text so fine they required magnification to read. Seal impressions on jar stoppers and document envelopes show the expansion of literacy into daily transactions. Even the illiterate encountered writing as image, a visible guarantee of authenticity. The act of rolling a seal across clay became a ritual of trust linking official and citizen. Conceptually, the legacy of the scribes completed the transformation of civilization from material achievement to intellectual system. The true inheritance of Sumer was not its walls or canals, but its way of thinking. That order could be preserved through symbol, that the world's complexity could be reduced to signs, and that the discipline of record was itself a form of faith. Through this discipline, the memory of the first cities crossed languages, empires, and centuries, surviving long after their bricks had melted back into the earth. By the dawn of the second millennium BC, the intellectual and technological frameworks first conceived in Sumer had spread across the ancient world. From the banks of the Nile to the citadels of Anatolia, from the highlands of Elam to the valleys of the Indus, echoes of Sumerian invention shaped every emergent culture. Archaeology confirms that the Mesopotamian city, though diminished, had become the prototype of civilization itself. The grammar of the urban world, its writing, its law, its architecture, its mathematics, all carried the unmistakable imprint of the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. Excavations across the Near East reveal this diffusion in layers of continuity. At Mari, thousands of clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian preserve the bureaucratic precision inherited from Ur and Lagash. In Elam, cuneiform was adapted into the Elamite script, while in Anatolia, the Hittites adopted the wedge to record their treaties and myths. Even Egypt, so distinct in its hieroglyphic tradition, borrowed Mesopotamian conventions of accounting and temple management. The spread of the seal, the contract, and the ration tablet marks a shared conceptual heritage that the written record could stabilize the state. The Sumerians had not merely created a culture, they had discovered a system capable of replication. At the heart of this system was the abstraction of number and measure. The sexagesimal base, developed in the scribal houses of Uruk 3 millennia earlier, persisted through Babylonian astronomy and Greek geometry into modern timekeeping. Archaeological finds of inscribed mathematical tablets, multiplication tables, reciprocals, and geometrical problems reveal the deep rationalism underlying ancient thought. Each line of cuneiform wedges represents the same principle that governs all modern data: the reduction of experience to calculable order. In this sense, every modern clock and calendar remains an echo of Sumer. The literary legacy is no less enduring. Tablets from Nippur and preserve versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a narrative first compiled from older Sumerian tales around 2000 BC. Excavations in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, dating a millennium later, show the same story preserved nearly verbatim in Akkadian. The epic's themes, mortality, kingship, the flood, encapsulate Sumer's philosophical vision that civilization is an act of defiance against impermanence. Through literature, the voice of the first city became universal. Its concerns, order, justice, memory, loss, would recur across the entire written tradition of humanity. The persistence of these texts is as much material as intellectual. Clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, endured fire and flood. When cities burned, their libraries were baked into permanence. Modern archaeologists recover in fragments what time meant to destroy. Grain accounts beside hymns, laws beside love songs, architecture manuals beside astronomical charts. The juxtaposition reveals the completeness of Sumerian rationality, a world where the sacred and the practical were continuous, where no distinction existed between engineering and theology. Every artifact of this civilization embodies that union, measure as devotion, record as faith. Conceptually, Sumer's greatest contribution was not its inventions, but its realization that knowledge could be preserved independently of those who made it. The clay tablet, the seal, and the script were technologies of immortality, devices that allowed human intention to survive beyond human presence. Through them, time ceased to erase and began to accumulate. The Sumerians transformed memory into matter, and in doing so, they founded history itself. The centuries following 1800 BC witnessed the transformation of Sumer's intellectual inheritance into the foundation of the ancient Near Eastern world. The Babylonian kingdoms that rose from the ruins of adopted and codified Sumerian methods so completely that later generations could no longer distinguish between innovation and preservation. Archaeological evidence from Babylon's earliest strata shows libraries organized in deliberate order, rooms lined with shelves of baked tablets, each labeled by topic. Within these archives, scribes stored everything from ritual incantations to field surveys, reflecting a belief that all knowledge was of equal significance once rendered in writing. The city itself became a living library, an embodiment of Sumer's final gift, the conviction that order could be archived. Most explicit expression of this inheritance appears in the Code of Hammurabi, ca. 1750 BC. Carved into a basalt stele over 2 meters high, its 282 clauses represent the culmination of a millennium of bureaucratic thought. Excavated fragments show the text organized like a ledger, with categories of offense and corresponding restitution. The visual and linguistic structure remains Sumerian: ruled lines, precise columns, declarative syntax. Each law functions as an equation balancing cause and consequence. If a man builds a house and it collapses, killing the owner, that builder shall be put to death. The moral logic is identical to the administrative logic of stability through symmetry, justice as measurement. Through this legal monument, the scribal mentality achieved public visibility. The influence of Sumer extended beyond law to cosmology. In the astral sciences of Babylon, the old numerical systems became instruments of divination and prediction. Excavations at Uruk and Sippar have yielded hundreds of tablets listing planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and omens derived from celestial events. The precision of these observations, often recorded to within a single day, reveals both the longevity of the sexagesimal system and the intellectual continuity of scribal culture. Astronomy, like irrigation before it, was a discipline of control, an attempt to domesticate uncertainty. The stars were catalogued as once were fields and herds, each name inscribed into the order of the cosmos. Culturally, the Sumerian legacy persisted in the texture of daily life. Cylinder seals continued to accompany documents and personal possessions, their imagery evolving but their function unchanged. Artisans still impressed marks of ownership onto jars and bricks, maintaining the belief that identity could be fixed through inscription. Even the architecture of Babylon's temples preserved the proportions of Sumerian ziggurats, rectangular terraces rising in geometric sequence, aligned with celestial axes. The bricks of these new monuments, stamped with royal names, echo the practice first seen in Uruk's precincts 2,000 years earlier. To write upon stone was to bind time itself. Meanwhile, the idea of writing as divine privilege matured into theology. In later Mesopotamian myth, the god Nabu, patron of wisdom and scribe of the heavens, appears as successor to the Sumerian goddess Nisaba. His stylus is said to record the fate of men upon tablets of destiny. Archaeologists uncover these myths not merely in text, but in art, reliefs showing deities holding reed pens, celestial tablets, and measuring cords. The image encapsulates Sumer's worldview that the act of inscription was the act of creation. By pressing symbol into matter, gods and humans alike participated in the maintenance of cosmic equilibrium. Conceptually, what endured from Sumer was not a culture frozen in clay, but a method for translating experience into permanence. Every later civilization that wrote, measured, and remembered inherited its framework. The chronologies of Egypt, the calendars of Mesoamerica, the alphabets of Greece, all arise from the same revelation first etched into riverine clay, that to write is to survive. Through this realization, Sumer ceased to be a place and became a principle, the first self-aware chapter of human history. By the late 2nd millennium BC, the Sumerian world had vanished as a political entity, yet its intellectual gravity still governed the civilizations that succeeded it. Excavations at Ashur, Nineveh, and Babylon expose layers of libraries built upon older ruins, each generation literally constructing its archives over the foundations of the last. The most famous of these, Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, 7th century BC, contained over 30,000 clay tablets. Many were direct copies of Sumerian and early Babylonian works, creation myths, flood stories, lexical lists, faithfully transcribed even when the language itself had long ceased to be spoken. Archaeologists find colophons appended to these tablets reading, written, and checked against the old master copy. The phrase is less bureaucracy than creed. Continuity had become a moral duty. The transmission of Sumerian knowledge through successive languages, Akkadian, Assyrian, Aramaic, Greek, illustrates the first documented lineage of intellectual inheritance. Scholars in Hellenistic Babylon still used the same sexagesimal system for astronomical tables that Uruk scribes had devised 3,000 years earlier. Fragments of clay tablets recovered from Seleucid strata show calculations for the motions of Jupiter employing identical numerical principles. The persistence of these forms through empires and religions attests to the power of abstraction. Once encoded in symbol, thought could outlive belief. Archaeological finds from the Persian Gulf to the Levant confirm that this continuity was not confined to scholars. Everyday objects, weights, seals, measuring rods, retain proportions traceable to Sumerian standards. The 1 shekel weight, the cubit of length, the gur of grain all descend directly from Mesopotamian metrology. Even after alphabets replaced cuneiform, merchants in Phoenician and Aramean ports traded by systems inherited from Sumer. The ledger, the receipt, and the balance scale, tools now taken for granted, were the descendants of the temple inventories of Uruk. Through commerce, the legacy of Sumer became the unspoken grammar of economy. In the religious imagination of the ancient Near East, Sumer's vision of divine order persisted under new names. The gods of measurement and writing reappeared across cultures, Thoth in Egypt, Hermes in Greece, Mercury in Rome, each bearing stylus, tablet, and scroll. Their iconography, when traced backward through art history, leads to the same source, the Sumerian scribe seated before his clay. In every civilization that followed, the image of wisdom remained that of a figure recording. The act of writing itself became sacred, a reflection of cosmic order. Modern archaeology reveals how profoundly this idea transformed human consciousness. Before Sumer, time was cyclical, anchored in ritual and season. After Sumer, it became linear, recorded, and comparative. The sequence of rains, the counting of years, the chronicling of events, all originated in cuneiform notation. Excavated king lists, now displayed in museums, show columns of rulers stretching backward into myth, the earliest attempt to organize memory as history. The very notion that human experience could be plotted along a line of succession arose from those tablets. To remember through writing was to create continuity where nature offered only recurrence. Conceptually, Sumer's ultimate legacy lies not in the inventions it produced, but in the consciousness it awakened. Its people discovered that civilization could think about itself, record its own structure, and transmit that self-awareness forward. Every library, law, and chronicle of later ages stands as a continuation of that insight. In pressing their styluses into clay, the Sumerians inscribed more than words. They defined the relationship between humanity and time. Through them, memory became architecture, and the written record became civilization's spine.